bonus on Israel, one of two. This is Matthew, and this is the first of two bonus episodes of Still Unbelievable, where Andrew and I chat with Eric, a lawyer, who has put extensive effort into researching the history of Israel. Eric is a Jew. He doesn't hide that, and he invites anyone to fact-check what he says. There are lots of links in the show notes where I have fact-checked the claims made during this episode, so please use them while doing your own checking. Some of my links are to Wikipedia items. This is because Wikipedia is very useful for combining relevant sources into a single location. So regardless of what you might think of Wikipedia editorials, make use of the references at the bottom of the page, because there will be far more links there than I can possibly fit into the show notes. I have also included links to specific journals and animated YouTube videos, which I found to be genuinely informative. One thing I did struggle with was non-biblical sources for the existence of kings Saul, David, Solomon and Absalom. Just about any reference to them made lots of use of biblical sources and little of anything else. That's not to say that good quality sources don't exist, just that I didn't find any that I was comfortable linking to. Something that does come up in the second half of this episode is the issue of the borders of Israel. Eric says that these borders were never officially set under international law and are still armistice lines. This appears to check out, and so I accept it as technically true. However, when you look at the area that Israel occupies now, it covers more than the area assigned in 1947. The Golan Heights, for example, were assigned to Syria, but now occupied by Israel. And the area that is now Gaza was originally much larger. While Israel's security concerns are valid, it is also easy to see why Israel's neighbours would feel aggrieved by the current land area that Israel occupies. But those neighbours will not make any diplomatic progress while they appear to support terrorist activity against Israelites. One thing that did impact me personally during this recording is the emotion that Eric displayed while telling the history of Jewish persecution. I do not know if there is such a thing as ancestral trauma, but from my perspective, the Jews who are alive today carry the trauma of many generations of savage persecution endured by their ancestors. I may never fully appreciate how deep that runs, but I do at least understand that this history is deeply motivating, and many Jews alive today carry it as a visceral pain. And this pain translates into a longing for the ancestral home, that is, the nation of Israel. Regardless of how I feel about specific actions by the existing government of Israel and how that impacts their neighbours, Jews today hold a desire for a land they call home and for a chance to live there peacefully. It's a desire that is shaped by the trauma of the past, both recent and distant. And this also informs how the nation of Israel responds to perceived threats. Whatever the rights and wrongs of how Israel has managed the situation in Gaza, the actions that have been performed are because of the traumas of the past. I don't think it's possible to have a rational discussion about the future of that region without first making an effort to grasp the horrors of the past. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This one's going to be a little bit somber. I do not apologise for that, and this is also going to be a bonus episode. It's not going to have a number attached to it. I've already edited and lined up the next 3 episodes of Still Unbelievable, so they will appear in the run-up into December. This episode, because of the events going on in the news today, is one that I've had an opportunity to have a conversation about, and so I've jumped onto that opportunity. But before I get to my guests, brief hello from Andrew and myself, your regular hosts. Andrew, how are you today?
I couldn't be better unless I was you. Hello, kids. Nice to be back on the mic, and I'm looking forward to this episode.
Right. As a taster for our listeners, last week, you, myself and David, we recorded an episode on stories. And so you've got that to look forward to, listeners. 4 episodes to go, so hang on tight and get through whatever is coming up before then. But I do have a short story to tell, which I managed to leave out of that episode. I had a school reunion earlier this year. Now, some people love school reunions. Some people detest them. But I had a school reunion, and one of the people at that school reunion was somebody, probably the only person during my school years who I actually had a physical fight with. And I went to a boarding school here in the UK, and it was initially set up as a boarding school for troubled boys. So there was a hefty bursary set up so that boys from less privileged backgrounds were able to come to it, as well as those who could afford to pay. And this lad was one of those less privileged boys from a rough background. He was a skinny, lanky lad. And of all the people that bullied me, he was probably the only one I could probably overpower if I really put my mind to it. But he was always surrounded by his bigger, stronger friends, so I never really had a chance. So as you can imagine, I left school and I really didn't like this guy. Then, so we roll forward 20, 30, however many years it is, I daren't count. I get a Facebook friend request from him, and literally my face went white. My reaction was, why the fuck would I want to accept this friend request from this guy? My memories of this guy from school are still that I would like to punch his face in after all these years. The memory is dark. The memory is deeply unpleasant. Why in all world, A, would he want to send me a Facebook friend request, and B, why would I even consider accepting it? So I checked out his profile, and I discovered that his history is he went into the army after school. The army sorted him out, got a bit of discipline into him. He actually progressed as far as special forces in the UK army. He's no longer a skinny, lanky guy, but he's a hefty built guy, very strong. I would definitely want him on my side if I was in trouble. So I decided to take the gamble, and I clicked accept, and we chatted a bit, and then we met at this school reunion this year. And I went straight up to him and I shook his hand and said, "Good to see you, sir." And it was a fabulous meeting. Genuinely, a weight came off my mind. Genuinely, I felt better for it. It was quite something.
Did you find out whether he remembered things largely the way you did? It's really an interesting story.
You know what? I couldn't even be bothered to ask him because I simply didn't care. I didn't care then, and I don't care now. It's gone. We've shaken hands as adults. We are no longer teenage boys detesting each other. And I honestly couldn't give a crap. We shook hands. We're adults. We shared a beer. We told stories like we were old friends. And that was actually what mattered.
Yeah.
So that's the lead up I want to do. So there's a tough question here. Eric, you're our guest here. We met on Twitter because Mark Ruffalo, of all people, I don't even follow him on Twitter. I have no idea why his Twitter comment landed in my timeline. And he made a comment which I thought was balanced. Let's not have violence. He didn't single out any side. He said, can we just not have violence? And you made a comment offering your services as somebody who can give information about what's going on in Israel and Palestine at this moment and the horrific stuff that's going on. And like a cheeky so-and-so as I am, because hey, I've got a platform, I'm a nobody down here, but I have a platform. If I reach out often enough, somebody will say, hey, all right, little guy, I'll have a chat with you. And bless you, Eric, you did. So Eric, you're a lawyer, you're in the Eastern Seaboard, not a long way away from my friend Andrew. Thank you so much for accepting that. We've had a little bit of a chance over the last couple of days to try to get to know each other. I'm genuinely hoping for a productive conversation, both for myself and for our listeners. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I attended the University of Florida, where I studied both journalism and history. While in undergraduate school, I spent a semester at Cambridge University on your side of the pond. And
you went back. You stayed here and you went back.
I know. Can you believe it? Although I have been back a couple times since, including part of a honeymoon actually we
Oh,
spent in
good for
London.
you, sir. Good for
Yes.
you, sir.
No, I love your country quite a lot, although there may be some things that we discussed today that won't be so comfortable, but I promise I'll be presenting things in a fair way, in a respectful way.
If I can just, sorry to interrupt you again. I'll let you carry on. For some context, because our listeners already know it, I grew up as a missionary kid in a missionary environment, so I do not hold back with the criticisms that I have for colonialism and the damage that the British did to those kind of countries. So in that kind of context, and I'm fairly sure I have a rough idea of what's coming, we deserve it. Let's just be straight
I think
about
you
it.
might even be surprised, to be honest. There are certain things that are discussed about Britain's role. Britain is both the antagonist and the protagonist of the story, really. In the years from about 1917 through till 1948, it is one of the most fascinating periods of time, what was called the British Mandate of Palestine. We'll certainly get into that, I'm sure. That's what I went to Cambridge to study.
Okay.
That's what I focused on. That's what I wrote about and had to defend to a Cambridge professor, which was a wonderful experience. I continued at the University of Florida for law school. Straight out of law school, I worked for the last 15 years as a civil trial defense attorney, a lot of time in the courtroom, a lot of time writing legal briefs. But the entire time, I did have this background, and I always had this interest in Jewish history. I am a Jew. My family came over to the United States in the early 1920s, escaping pogroms, which are some of the only things in terms of their specific type of barbarity that rival what Hamas just did. My family escaped those and came over to the US and made a life here. But anyway, so 15 years as an attorney, but my passion has always been both Jewish history and Israeli history, and it's just always been something that's fascinated me. And when I started doing my research, really back in Cambridge, I started a running list. I didn't know what I was keeping it for, but it's now 3,000 single-spaced pages of my notes, of my thoughts, of my analysis that covers 2 decades. About a year ago, after just seeing some things that sort of just upsetting me in the media, both in terms of anti-Semitism and in the way that I felt that Israel was being portrayed, which I did not think was accurate or fair, I felt compelled to do something that was sort of strange. I was sort of wondering to myself, this latest generation is now about 80 years removed from the Holocaust. It's basically irrelevant to them. And this latest generation has only ever known a world where there is a strong state of Israel. But that is not the story of the Jewish people. That is really only the story of the Jewish people since 1967. For the 2,000 years that preceded that, from when the Second Temple was destroyed, Jews were massacred all over the world, and we can get into various reasons if you'd like, including being the first blood libel was in England, actually. I don't know if you know about the blood libel. We can get into that, but
I'm familiar with the phrase, but it
Yes.
would help me to be reminded of what it means.
Sure. I'll just briefly go into it, but again, because I'm in this sort of intro, and you'll forgive me, I do, because I have so much crammed into my head, I will sometimes go off on a tangent, and I don't want to do that. So can we put a pin in the blood libel thing? And
Sure,
okay
wherever it fits in the context, that's good. Andrew won't let me forget it.
Okay, great. And I'll just finish a very quick wrap up. The bottom line is, about a year ago, I started thinking, how is it that this generation is learning their information? If I sat there and wrote a book, I was concerned that the only people who were going to buy and read my book are people who already agree with me, or, generally see things the way that I do. And what good is that doing? That's just more of that, people in their own bubbles and talking into echo chambers. And my research is extensive. It is not one-sided. I have opinions that some people would probably consider one-sided, but I am open to declaring that, and I'm here to provide only historically verifiable facts from which people can draw their own conclusions, and I will respectfully, accept that. But a year ago, I downloaded an animation program because I was actually, I saw this YouTube channel called Oversimplified, had hundreds of millions of views of animated history. And I cannot do what they do. I am not an artist, but it just became sort of a stress reliever, something I did just on the side. And now I have about 90 minutes of very rough first draft animations of Jewish history from Abraham all the way up to the mid 19th century. And, before I got into trying to figure out how I'm ever going to get these things polished and published, I wanted to gain a following. I had avoided social media like the plague ever since Facebook first came to my campus. It just was not for me. I decided to start the X page under the name Captain Allen, because at the time I was still working at my firm. Captain Allen is my grandfather. He fought in World War II against the Nazis. He, was my inspiration in thinking that while it's a very different call to action that he had, I felt that I had my own call to action to use the skills and knowledge that I've developed to try to do something to ensure the future of my people and to ensure a better world for my son. And so I've now, I made this Twitter account or X account with, and I put out history. I stay away from politics. I try to stay away from religion when I can because most of this is just historically based. I cover Jewish history, Israeli history, Jewish identity, and international law and other legal matters relating to the state of Israel. My goal is to educate young Jews so that they're not pushed around on campuses and feeling, denigrated and suffering anti-Semitism and not really knowing where they come from or who they are, so not knowing what to say back, or just if they could be a little bit more proud and have their chin up, that would be everything to me. And I'm also reaching for people of all backgrounds who just have an open mind or are just curious. I'm not trying to reach the people whose minds are made up and where they have their core beliefs. I understand that that's always going to happen in an emotional topic. I want to reach Jews who don't know enough about their history, and I want to reach people from all backgrounds, non-Jews, I don't care who you are, if you're just curious and if you just want to know things in good faith. And that's what I saw in your request for this, is somebody who was just asking questions in good faith. And so that's what I hope to do today and going forward.
Eric, thank you for being here. And you are appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
This podcast, if it is nothing else, it is a safe space. And if you are listening right now and you feel like you're an anti-Semite or that you think we shouldn't be a safe space, turn the podcast off, hit unsubscribe. We don't need you.
I appreciate you saying that. It reminds me, well, anyway, you remember back in 2000, Al Gore picked as his running mate Joe Lieberman, the first time ever that there was an American Jew attached to a major party ticket. And when somebody asked him about, was he concerned that he might lose a bunch of votes because of that? And I still remember what he said. I mean, it was 23 years ago, but what he said was, I don't think that there are so many anti-Semites in America, and if there are, I sure hope they don't vote Democratic. It just sort of stuck with me. I mean, I think that unfortunately the world has changed in a lot of ways since then, but I could appreciate the sentiment, whether or not a person sees the anti-Semitism or not. The fact that, there are people willing to stand up and say, I will not associate with anti-Semites is very much appreciated. I think that where the problems lie is that there's the easy anti-Semitism to spot, if somebody has swastikas that are tattooed on their shoulders or necks, or SS
Mm-hmm.
logo. I think that that's outside and has been outside of polite society for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Although there were some years in the early 30s that you could get away with it in America, before Pearl Harbor, and then America's entering the war. But regardless, that's outside. Really, the kinds of anti-Semitism that are most concerning to me, and that I feel requires education, is the more insidious kind. It is the kind that pushes Jews out of progressive places. I mean, it's just it is absolutely staggering to me that, for example, there could be LGBTQ pride parades, and there were members who held up essentially a version of the Israeli flag, but it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't. It just had a Star of David in the middle, and then it had the flag, the pride flag, and they were forced to leave because they said that that Zionism was a form of oppression and that they were not welcomed there. And it was just astonishing, especially because if they went to Gaza, they would be murdered for being homosexuals. That's just the truth. They throw homosexuals from the roofs of buildings. That's what they do in Iran. That is this barbarism that you're seeing. And that is only one example. But the point is that there are people out there who have bought into a certain narrative that the world is split into oppressors and oppressed, and that somehow the Jews, arguably the most oppressed people of all time, and we can discuss why I would say that, are suddenly seen as the elite oppressors, as the ultimate white people, even though we weren't accepted as white until maybe 50 years ago. And still today, the KKK and the Aryan Nation and neo-Nazis, they don't consider us white. So we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. And then the bottom line is, there is this bizarre convergence and strange bedfellows where there's the extreme left and the extreme right, and the only thing they can agree on is that the Jews are to blame.
The thing that I think deserves some unpacking in what you said there, and by the way, we're not anti-Semites on this show, though we may find things about which we disagree. Even with the best clear heads and coming at it as evenly as we can possibly come at it, we may disagree. There's no anti-Semitism here. And the thing that bothers me, and the thing that always bothers me, you can be Jewish and not be a Zionist. There's this sort of mixing of ideas. And I'm not even sure I know what Zionists think. I'm not sure that label applies to a group of people as much as it's just some sort of verbal attack, right? I'm not even sure that the phrase means anything beyond just some sort of false labeling, right? So it'd be worth unpacking that. But
we need to.
Yeah, I could.
What you just said, but continue, please.
Well, it just seems to me that this kind of thing, where you take a group of people and you label them with some counterproductive label, is the kind of thing that's designed to stifle a conversation that we should otherwise have. We see it with the LGBTQIA2 plus community. Yes, I do that just about every time. I don't care how long the acronym becomes, right? I don't care. There's a level of respect that we should try to offer in conversation, just to find a place where we can start, right? If we can't do that together, then we're probably all wasting our time. So tell me about Zionism.
Let me, if you don't mind, ask you, if somebody said to you, what's the definition of Zionism? I'm curious, because this, I think, will help to narrow the conversation. What would be your response?
I would imagine that it's somebody who feels who doesn't separate the Israeli nation from their Jewish religion to the extent that the location of Israel is God ordained and should be maintained at all costs because of that. And there is something else there which I'm struggling to reach, but I think it's more than just about the border and state. There is something else behind Zionism, which is about being better because of God, because you're God's chosen people. And I think my imagine, I can see on your face that I'm obviously going off track.
No, it's
but
please,
that's the kind of image that features in my face. So it gets ugly. Zionism to me is something that's ugly and separate to being Israeli and Jewish.
That breaks my heart, and I will explain why. Zionism, very simply, is the national liberation movement for the Jewish people. The definition of Zionism is the belief that the Jews are a normal people that became essentially an abnormal people because they were stateless and powerless for about 1800 years. And therefore, Zionism is the belief that the Jews have a right to become a normal people by having sovereignty in their ancient homeland. That's it. That's all that Zionism means. It is the belief that the Jews have a right to a state, not even necessarily in all of the land, but in at least a portion of the land that is the only place on earth that Jews can call home. Many Jews call different places home, like I do, but Israel is at the very least every Jew's second home. And for all of the years since we were, I want to jump. First of all, do you understand what I mean when I say that that's what Zionism is? Again, we start from there.
Yes, I understand. I'll find a link for a definition of Zionism. I'll put it in the show notes. So as an aside, listeners, things that are said, I'll fact check what I can, and links in the show notes. Please check on that. And if Eric can obviously provide me with anything, I'll put those in the show notes. So check the show notes as usual. So I guess for me is what I need clarifying is, what is because one of the things I said was my understanding of Zionism is the God-ordained location of Israel and all that.
That's the part.
Where is that? Where is that relationship? And am I wrong, or is it subtly different to what you said?
So look, there's the old Jewish joke: you put 10 Jews in a room, you get 12 opinions. Okay. So there's no hive mind when it comes to Jews, but there is one thing that we all agree on and have forever, and that is that we come from this land that has been called the Kingdom of Israel, the Kingdom of Judah, Judea, Yehud, and then Eretz Israel, which is what we refer to it as after the Kokhba Revolt. And I need to get into a little bit more history, but first I want to answer your question with a piece of history that you may not be aware of. All of the founding fathers of Israel, the vast majority of the early Zionist pioneers were secular.
What period of time are you talking about when you're talking about the pioneers of Israel? Are you talking about the modern state of Israel?
I am. I'm talking. Okay. So the first Aliyah was
Herzl and that crowd.
Well, Herzl came a little bit later. Herzl was the man who took the idea of Zionism and really, he was just a brilliant man. He was able to take an idea and found a state, even though he died at a young age of only 44 before the state was born. But he knew that this is what had to happen. He was at the Dreyfus Affair. I don't know if you're familiar with that. This is why I'm saying there's so many different tangents we could go down. But what I want you to know, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, was secular. I mean, in a lot of ways, the state of Israel, there's one thing I need to explain. Here's a good way of putting this. If you say to an American, finish this sentence, Jews and, most of the time you're going to hear Christians. or you might
That's
hear,
what happened in my head. Yep.
sure, or you might hear Muslims or something like that. If you say to an Israeli, Jews and, they will say Arabs.
Interesting.
Now, that is almost across the board, and there's a reason for that. Judaism is an ethno-religion. It really predates the idea that a religion can be spread around the world to various different people, the way that Christianity was. You notice there are no Jewish missionaries. Jews do not proselytize, and it's not because we think we're better than anybody. It's just because we are a people that come from Judea, and part of our identity involves a spiritual component, which is the religion, the religious aspects. And even those secular Jews, there are atheist Jews who are very committed to their Jewish identity. There's a brilliant professor who taught for a while at Georgetown. She is also a former left-wing Labor MK, member of Knesset. Her name is Einat Wilf. She is a proud atheist and a proud Jew. Now, let me ask you, you ever hear of an atheist Christian? You laugh. Exactly. You ever hear of an atheist Muslim? No, but Judaism, the only people that still exist on this planet to where if you got in a time machine and went back 2,000-3,000 years, you could share the same language, the same religion generally, the same culture generally, portions of it at least. You could understand each other. You could speak and have a conversation. You would have things in common. Jews, the Chinese, and the Indians. That's it. The Greeks, I'm sorry, but if they went back and tried to speak to Aristotle, they would not be speaking the same language. They would have very little in common. Modern day Italians, or if they went back to speak to Marcus Aurelius, it would be, or back to Caligula, they would not be the same culture. The Jews are an ancient people. And let me ask you actually one more question, because I'm curious about this. How many Jews would you say there are in the world today?
Ooh, I feel like that's a trick question.
No, it's not a trick question. I want to know.
I have no idea what kind of ballpark to even aim at, and that's partly because I don't know any. I simply don't know any.
In the run up to the podcast, well, that's not true. I had no idea we were doing this podcast, but when
I sprung this on Andrew. Andrew normally has more notice for these things, but this has been thrown at him.
Yeah, so I'm going to largely sound like an idiot, but I do that even when I'm prepared. So I did, when the war broke out, I wanted to understand what the balance of force looked like. And so I went off and asked Google and the various other assistants out there what the population of Israel was. And that seems to be generally agreed somewhere around 9.2 million in Israel. And Palestine, on the other side, seems to be generally agreed to be just over 5 million. And then, of course, you got the Gaza Strip that I guess is home to about 2.2 million people, give or take. But trying to go beyond that and ask the question, how does that relate to Jews living outside Israel? I have no idea if that number. I don't know
where to go. I'm going to say double it. But it's a pure guess. I really couldn't tell you.
But to start out, you didn't know that there were 9.2 million people living in Israel, which, by the way, only 7 million of whom are Jews, 2 million are Arabs, and the remainder are various other nationalities,
sure.
Druze and Bedouin and Alawites and
right, as you'd expect with any blended national population. So So
Mahmoud Abbas would tell you that his future state, if he ever has one, must be Judenrein, just like what Hitler wanted. Not a single Jew would be allowed to live in a future Palestine. And he has repeated that over and over. It is well documented for years, just so you know. It's 15 million is the answer.
15 million?
15 million. How many Christians do you think there are?
Oh,
that's a much bigger, that's about a billion or something like that, isn't it?
2.4 million at conservative estimate.
So
2.8 billion.
2.8. I'm sorry, I said million.
Billion with
a
B.
Billion.
Yeah.
Right.
2.8 billion Christians, yep. 2 billion Muslims,
yep.
15 million Jews. And the area, it is 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. And the area of Israel, you know, when it's shown on television, you often just see a picture of basically, you know, Israel and what people will call West Bank or Judea and Samaria, and we can talk about why people call them that, and Gaza, and you just see it like that. But when you zoom out, you have a massive Arab world of 200 million and a state of Israel with 9 million people, 7 million of whom are Jews. So
by the way, I don't know what the population of Canada or Mexico is either. So yes, I didn't know how many people are in Israel, but I also don't know how many are in Canada or Mexico. So
no, it wasn't a test. It was really because, you know, I point this out because I'm going to give you another statistic. Israel as a just land mass makes up, I believe it comes out to 0.02% of the land mass on Earth. The Jewish people come out to, it's about the same, you know, 1/5 of 1%. There's a little bit of difference there, but the bottom line is it is significantly less than 1%. And in terms of media coverage, Israel alone gets the 6th most media coverage, the vast majority of which is negative. There is an obsession that exists with that part of the world and with Jews, and we can talk about why that is. But then if you also add in the words West Bank and Gaza, it is the 3rd most discussed nation on Earth behind only the United States and China, countries with a combined population of 3 billion. There are cities, several of them, in China that have more Chinese nationals than the entire population of Israel. In fact, if we just talk about the 15 million Jews that still exist worldwide, there are 12 cities on Earth with populations larger than the population, the entire population of Jews that remain on this planet. So there is a certain obsession that exists. You would think that this war has been going on for thousands of years and that millions of people have died. And when you look at the statistics on how many people have died and compare it to other, it's horrible how conflicts, have been largely ignored, where you see 5 to 10 times more the number of deaths than you see, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The population of the Palestinians ever since 1948, with the start of the modern state of Israel, has only ever gone up. So for those people who like to use the word genocide, that's the worst genocide I've ever heard of. It is constantly in a state of growth. What I think really we need to do is I need to give you guys a little bit of an overview of, some Jewish history as a whole, so that you can understand where Zionism came from. And what I'll do is, I don't want to ramble on forever, so I'm going to say that feel free to just chime in and interrupt me. And also, if you want to go a different direction right now, it looks like you have something to say. Please ask away.
I'd certainly like to make a comment on the last few minutes, and certainly yes, the presence of Jews in media, not just news, but media in general, and I don't have much difficulty believing what you've just said. I'm very aware that there are certain people in the conspiracy corners of the web and Jews come up related to that, or the Rothschilds associated with the Jews, and all sorts of stuff, and the Jews control the gold, or the Jews control the diamonds, or the Jews control the banking system.
We control everything. How'd you know that?
I'm very much aware that exists. I ignore it because I think it's unhelpful, and I wish people would stay away from that kind of conversations. Certainly the news that I see that relates to Israel and the occupants of Israel is very much related to conflict. It's certainly in the areas of the world, it certainly seems to be a part of the world which has way more than its fair share of conflict.
Which is also depressing, because Israel is a modern day success story, and it's been defined by the world through conflict. It is the startup nation. Other than Silicon Valley, there is more innovation coming out of the Tel Aviv area than anywhere else on earth. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing so many Arab countries in the region wanting to sign on to these Abraham Accords and normalize with Israel. It's because it is the equivalent of Nevada, Utah, and Arizona just pretending that they're not going to recognize that Silicon Valley in California exists. It's just technology. That's the center. I mean, if you use Waze, you're using an Israeli app. If you drive,
which I do every day.
Yeah. If you use an autonomous vehicle that has even the slightest autonomous features, chances are it came from Mobileye, which is an Israeli company. Intel makes a lot of their products in Israel. Basically, if you want to support BDS, boycott, divest, sanction, and this iPhone that I'm holding in my hand, you can't use it because but a lot of the parts inside of it were developed in Israel. Israel is the innovation nation. It is the startup nation. Even things like drip irrigation, we have mastered how to turn arid desert into a land that can be fertile and feed entire populations. The biggest problem for thousands of years in the Middle East was a lack of water. Israel is the leader in desalination, and they even have machines now that they happy to even share with their neighbors that literally makes clean drinking water out of thin air. I'm just saying that Israel is so much more than the conflict, and that is what is so painful about it. That we need to know about the conflict, we need to understand the conflict. But I've spent a lot of time in Israel, and I've always felt safe. The conflict is not what's going on. You see a vibrant culture and society, and you see happy people. You see people at the beach, people with hijabs or keffiyehs, and people with yarmulkes, and then just kids in shorts and t-shirts. I mean, it's an eclectic mix, and it's people living their lives, and they don't have this conflict in every moment of their lives. They are having careers, they're having lives, and unfortunately, we're still in a very dangerous area, and some of our neighbors still don't accept our very existence. And therefore, we always have to be at the ready for conflict.
So I work in technology, as does Andrew, and I did know that Israel was a technological powerhouse. So I was aware of that. I don't think you can work in technology and not know that. So I at least knew that. I didn't know, or still don't know, the absolute extent of it, but I do know that is true.
Just in the last couple of days since the Hamas attack, there are about 2,000 people who've lost their lives just in the last 4 days. And
this will be a very bloody conflict. Very. This is war. This is not just a terror attack. This is the first time Israel has declared war since 1973.
I was checking the U.S. defense casualty system, and this war, in just this very brief time, 3 or 4 days, I'm not exactly sure where the international date line falls for where I am at the moment. So, but from the beginning, there are 2,000 lives, probably more than that. Just as we speak, people are dying as we speak. But in the Gulf War, so people will remember the Gulf War, the U.S. had fewer casualties in the entire Gulf War, according to the U.S. Defense Casualty System, than what has been experienced since the beginning of this war. So roughly
It's not surprising,
twice.
but how many Iraqis died? That's the real question.
I
Because
don't.
that will be well into the hundreds of thousands, and it will be larger than the amount of Arabs that have died in total for every Arab-Israeli war. I would be shocked if that's not the case. Certainly, if you include also the 2003 Iraq War, it will blow it out of the water. But maybe even just in the Gulf War, just the Arab casualties would be higher than in all of Israel's wars combined.
I'm sure. The reason I pulled the stat out was to give our listeners, who are almost all Western listeners, not quite, but almost all Western listeners, some sense of how did we feel about our service people dying in the Gulf War, right? And with twice the number of casualties already, now admittedly that's both sides rather than one side, but the state of Israel has had the same number of casualties from the beginning a couple of days ago to now.
1,200 about.
Yeah, right. That's actually more than what the U.S. covered.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Well, I mean, 1,200 is more than what the U.S. suffered during the entire Gulf War. And so I'm just trying to appeal to listeners to remember what the national psychology was during that time.
I'm going to put it in a slightly different term, but using your exact type of analogy for putting it into context for Americans or for Westerners. If you just go by population percentages and things like that, because Israel is such a small country in comparison to the United States, for example, I mean, everybody in Israel either knows somebody or is family members with somebody who died or is currently being held hostage in Gaza. That's how small the country is. What occurred on 10/7 was, by percentage population, equivalent to 10 9/11s in one day. And I hate to massacre compare, but quite frankly, if I was given choice between being, and it's a horrible choice, in the Twin Towers when the plane hit, being what Hamas did on 10/7, the level of barbarism with the rapes and murders of women and children and beheading of babies. And I mean, some of the things that happened are just beyond what humans should be capable of, but unfortunately humans have proved that they are capable of it. You're talking about girls being raped while their boyfriends are forced to watch, and then she's killed and he's taken hostage. These things happened. They went door to door and massacred entire families. They murdered elderly. They murdered the infirm and disabled, people of all ages, and they were laughing while they did it. All the eyewitnesses say they heard the Arabs talking in Arabic and laughing as they were massacring children. So what I'm saying is, what happened in Israel, because it's such a small country and because of the specific level of barbarity, actually, when people say it was Israel's 9/11, and I'm somebody who remembers 9/11 quite well, and it was terrifying, and my sister was in New York at the time, it was so much worse because of the percentage of the population that was mutilated, defiled, murdered, massacred, and also taken hostage, and God knows what's happening to them in Gaza now. So just putting that into perspective, imagine 10 9/11s on the same day, plus not just people who happen to be flying planes into buildings, but also people on the streets of Manhattan with AK-47s and machetes. I hate to be so graphic, but unfortunately, this is what it is. One pregnant woman had her belly sliced open by a Hamas terrorist. The baby was ripped out and choked to death with its umbilical cord. Who can do these things? This is a level of barbarism that goes beyond what most especially Western human beings, really can comprehend. Although I think it's basically everybody, but unfortunately, because of ISIS, there's a lot of people in the Middle East who got used to some of these barbaric acts. But it is in a lot of ways a battle of civilizations. This is not a religious battle, but it is in a lot of ways a battle of civilizations, a battle between modernity and medievalism.
Yes, it's barbaric.
Absolutely.
And so let's all get on the same page there. There's no question the attack was orchestrated. The weapons, those that are homemade and those that were contributed by Iran and who knows where else, were stockpiled specifically to cause not a war but an atrocity. This was a civilian attack, not a military attack. This wasn't military on military. And to then go beyond that and to realize that the airborne attack was into a civilian population, and then to have the ground attack further proceed into the civilian population. I realize that there were some military components and there were some base attack and all that sort of, not what I'm talking about. I am specifically talking about deliberately going into Main Street and taking hostages. There's hopefully no one listening who can think that that was okay. And like I said earlier, if you're one of the people that thinks it is, you can turn off, hit unsubscribe. We'll be fine. So yes, it's horrific. And I don't care what population of people it is. It's horrific. There is no civilian population that deserves our worst enemy, whoever that is, the United States. Our worst enemy doesn't deserve, the average person isn't prosecuting war. Okay, I'm going to hand the mic back. My apologies.
I appreciate your words.
Yeah, I echo all of that. I can't watch videos of assault of any kind, and I certainly have not watched any of the videos that have gone through my social media feed because I can't. I have no desire whatsoever to see that kind of thing. Knowing that it happened is bad enough, frankly. It will serve no purpose for me watching that kind of thing. It's despicable. I'd like to set the scene before I make my comments. My listeners know, Andrew knows, in the 70s, living in Africa, Zimbabwe is coming up for independence. I had my own family tragedy. Nobody died. I'm very glad about it. But there was a kidnapping involved by Zimbabwe freedom fighters, because in the 70s and 80s, we called them freedom fighters. Today, we would obviously call them terrorists. Some of what I've read about today has brought me back unpleasant memories of my childhood from that moment, to the point where I've had a little bit of trauma flashback, which is something I've never experienced since 1978 when that originally happened. And that thing happened off the back of a country trying to seek its own independence from what Britain was doing, my own country. British. I had a British passport. I've always had a British passport. But what happened that day was as a result, indirectly, of what was happening in Britain. So my comment is, and 9/11 was mentioned. Just after 9/11, the American ambassador to the UK went on to, I think it was Question Time. It was a late evening news and current affairs program here in the UK. And the US ambassador to the UK came onto that program the first time it aired after 9/11. So it would have been within a few days. And he understandably expected a reception that was filled with sympathy. But what he got was, in amongst that sympathy, an extraordinarily rough ride, which went along the lines of, American foreign policy is crap. It sucks. You're arrogant to the rest of the world. Why are you surprised that this happened? They almost went as far as saying, you kind of deserved it. But they didn't really say that. But what they did say was, how can you be so blind as to think that people hate you, as not realize that people hate you enough to do this? So while he did get sympathy, he did get quite battered as well. And I think he was quite surprised by the forcefulness of that kind of comment on him. And I don't want to make that comment anywhere near as strongly, but there is the question, because I've seen it on social media, to what extent did Israel, I'm not going to say the word deserve because that's not true, but to what extent should Israel have expected this? And to what extent do we have the historical, political policies and behaviors in the region? And this is where we're going to get to the history that might have driven this. And I hope I've been sensitive in expressing that.
Yes, you don't have to mince words. I want to know what goes on in your head because it's not uncommon. You're not a bad person for thinking anything you think. I can see that you have a kind heart. I think that a lot of people only know what they've seen. And if they don't take the time to learn more on their own, and a lot of us just have really busy lives, we can't know about everything, then, your opinion is just sort of what you happen to see on the news. And that's about it. So, I'm going to now sort of give you a general overview of some history of the region and how we sort of ended up where we are today. I'm going to, because I could talk to you about it, we could have a podcast for the next month.
Probably,
so I'm not going to do that. But I'm still going to start very early, but I'm going to focus on more recent. Okay? All right. So I don't rely, because I'm a lawyer and a historian, I don't rely on the Bible for anything in terms of how long a people has been somewhere. So what I can tell you is, the first Jew, was Abraham, according to the Bible, according to, what you would call the Old Testament, who would have come through Shechem, which today is called Nablus and is an Arab city entirely, and though it's got it's a long history there too. But, historically, the idea was he came through around 1800 BCE. What we can say archaeologically, from what has actually been found, is that there was a people, a nation of Israel that existed, a people of Israel, back at least as far as 1208 BCE. We know that from something called the Merneptah Stele. It was recovered somewhere around Luxor, Egypt, I believe in the 1800s. A stele is like a large stone slab that rulers would like to sort of record their, whether it was true or not, battle victories on them. And then one of it says Israel's seed has been spilled in the soil or something like that. It's the first time that you see in archaeological evidence that there was a people, Israel, living there adjacent to Egypt. It's called the Merneptah Stele because it was during the time of Pharaoh Merneptah. So we know that. We know.
So would that word Israel have meant a people group, or was it a family name, or was it something larger than that?
There are a lot of names for Jews. Let me just actually give you this real quick because this may be helpful. We've been known as Hebrews. We've been known as Israelites. We have been known as the people Israel. Israel is not just the name of a state today. We are actually the people Israel. And Israel means struggle with God, one who struggles with God.
Yeah.
That's who we are. We are the people who struggle with God.
Is that a direct reference to the Old Testament story?
Yes, the actual wrestling of the angel, but it is also seen in Judaism as a metaphor where Jews do not ask for blind faith. You're always supposed to question everything. Wrestling with God is a part of being a Jew. It's literally wrestling with the realities of life and with the things that we don't understand and that happen, and with the teachings, of our ancient texts. It's wrestling with them. It's not just accepting them. And that's built into our culture.
The story of Jacob is where the wrestling with God. Jacob wrestles, he doesn't wrestle with God. Yes, I know it was an angel, but that is the story in the Old Testament that we're talking about, if I get you.
And I'm not a theologian, and if I say something that is incorrect about the Old Testament, I am a Jew. I am an observant Jew. I am not an Orthodox Jew. I have knowledge for the 40 plus years of my life about the Jewish religion, but I do not consider myself an expert on any religious matters the way that I do about historical and legal ones, for what it's worth. There was a people, Israel, at least as far back as 1208 BCE, and this general area which you can just call the Levant. That's just an easier way to just refer to the area. The Levant would be that entire area of the Fertile Crescent, as they called it, on the easternmost portion of the Mediterranean Sea, basically where Israel is today, and continuing on up through modern-day Lebanon and Syria, basically up to the Euphrates River. The Fertile Crescent then continues on into northern Iraq and Mesopotamia, where supposedly the Garden of Eden would have been. The Levant would be specifically those areas, including modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria.
Historically, then, has all the way back to that time, can we see that it was a fertile area?
It was called the Fertile Crescent for a reason.
Okay.
It's in the shape of a crescent if you think about it.
Yeah.
But obviously it's not all fertile. I mean, 60% of Israel is Negev desert, so that makes the land even smaller.
Yeah.
Right. And its next door neighbor, Egypt, is similarly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So for that,
but it
period
also has
of
a
time,
city.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So for that period of time, it was obviously an attractive parcel of land.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's the gateway to 3 continents. So it had importance for centuries, if not millennia, for that very reason. And that's also why there has been so much war fought over it by plenty of people who were neither Jews nor Arabs for thousands of years. We could get bogged down in some of this because the history really is so long. I invite and want you to please jump in with questions at any time, but I'm going to basically try to give some highlights and run through some things so that I can bring us up to a more modern era. Okay?
Right.
We know that there were people who, this is what I was saying about Jews. I want you to understand, I mentioned that if I say Eretz Israel, which is land of Israel, if I say Judea, if I say Yehud, if I say Judah, it all means the same place. It's within different borders, but it's all that same area of the Levant that we look at today on maps.
Okay.
And now if we talk about Jews, we talked about Israelites, we talked about Hebrews, we talked about the first major empire that comes through would be the Greek Empire. And they call us Judeos, which translates into Judeans. They called the land Judea. And then the Romans called the land Judeas and also called us Judeans. That's what that means. It wasn't until 1275 CE and Britain that the English shortened it to Jews. And because English has become the dominant language.
It's always the English fault, isn't it?
It's not a fault. There's nothing wrong with it. But Jews are Jews because we are the descendants of the people of Judea. Period.
Okay, I never realized that Jew was a shortening of Judeans. That's new information for me.
Arabs are from the peninsula of Arabia.
Right.
Jews are from the area of Judea.
Makes sense when you put it like that. Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
Did you say,
just sort of. Yeah. Go ahead.
Did you say 1275 BCE?
No.
The shortening. Oh, okay.
I apologize.
No, I don't. I probably misheard you, but I am trying to keep notes because we're going to get through the build-up, and I suspect that the notes are going to become important. So my apologies.
No, please. And I would like you to interrupt me at any time. My goal is not to just hear myself talk. My goal is to make sure that I'm providing you with something that actually helps you understand what you're seeing on TV better. I'm just going to speak about archaeological evidence really quick, and I'm just going to run through a few things, okay? I'm going to stay away largely from biblical sources, except to the extent that they have been independently verified by archaeological finds, okay? So we know there were these people. I'm just going to say Jews just so it's easier, okay? Yep. Even though nobody was calling them Jews then, okay? But we know by now the study of literally millions of Jews' DNA. There are groups that have done it. Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi Jews who were spread all over the world all share DNA from the Levant. And then another percentage of our DNA comes from, mostly the first 500 years after the exile, where we were intermingling with local populations. That's why we all tend to look a bit different. I mean, there are Chinese Jews, there are Indian Jews. It depends on where you went, and not everybody had relations with their own. And so
Yeah.
we all look a little bit different, but we all share at least about 25% of our genetic markers. And we share more genetic markers. I share more genetic markers as an Ashkenazi Jew with a Sephardic Jew or with a Mizrahi Jew. And if I can, Ashkenazi Jew would basically be Jews that around 700 to 1000 CE made their homes in the Rhineland, and eventually through the course of events made their way further to the east and into places like Ukraine and Romania and Latvia and Russia, etc. That would be the Ashkenazi Jews. Those are the ones that people typically think of as quote unquote white, although I can tell you that Ashkenazi Jews come in all different colors. Many of them are olive skinned. Sephardic Jews are those Jews who made their way, instead of going from Israel into Ashkenazi Jews basically went from Israel into Italy. They followed the Rhone up to the Rhine, because in those days you didn't have roads, so you followed rivers. And that's how they wound up in the Rhineland. And what's interesting here is a little bit of, we were talking before we started about Southern culture, and obviously the stereotype of, which is not true, the stereotype of incestuous relationships. Well, every single Ashkenazi Jew on the planet comes from 375 people that lived in the Rhineland sometime around 900 CE. So just so you know. Sephardic Jews are the ones that went from Israel across northern Africa, and after the Moors invaded Spain, Jews followed them into Spain, because for a while Jews had better relations, at least comparatively speaking, with Arabs and Muslims than they did with Christians, and I will explain why about that. But when I say Sephardic,
we can probably guess that one, I think.
Possibly, but I'm sure there are details that might surprise you. But anyway, the Sephardic Jews are the Jews. There was about a 400-year golden age. This is why people say, in America, Jews have only really lived relatively comfortably for, about 100 years. There was 300 to 400 years of a golden age in Spain. And then there was the Alhambra Decree, 1492, that the start of the Spanish Inquisition, where 200,000 Jews were expelled. The entire Jewish community was expelled from Spain, and those who did not get out were murdered. A lot of those who were trying to flee were taken advantage of by ship captains who stole all of their possessions and often then threw them overboard so that they could fit more Jews on the boat so that they could steal more of their possessions. It was a horrible time. But that's how you wound up with Jews in Latin America. Some of them went west, which is why you'll have Argentinian Jews and Brazilian Jews and things like that who are still speaking Spanish. They went into those colonies. Didn't always work out too well because the Inquisition spread around the world. Did not go well for Mexican Jews, for example. There were a lot of what were called crypto Jews, who were essentially Jews who agreed to convert so as not to have to be expelled, but really they were still practicing their faith in private. Those are known as, the Marranos or crypto Jews, depending on where you are. So that's what I mean when I say Sephardic. When I say Mizrahi, those would be the Jews that went east from Israel. So, into Babylon, the Jews that stayed in Babylon, basically, or in Persia, the areas that are today, Iraq and Iran, Syria. There were massive Jewish communities in the Arab world until the 40s, when they were all expelled and had their possessions all taken from them. We hear a lot about Palestinian refugees, of which there were originally around 700,000 after the 48 war. There were 850,000 refugees from the Arab countries that were all told that they needed to leave, even though they had roots in those areas, some going back 2,700 years. They were there longer than the Arabs. But when you're the minority and the government tells you it's time to leave, and you can only take the shirt on your back, you either stay and die or you leave. And Israel absorbed all of those immigrants, and Israel was not always the powerful country that we think of today. Israel was a very poor country in its early years, and it was trying to take Holocaust survivors who had nothing, and now 850,000 Jews from Arab lands who came with nothing and had to absorb them and provide them with housing and with food and with lives. So it was a major struggle early on. But anyway, I'm getting off on a bit of a tangent here. I just wanted to define for you what is an Ashkenazi Jew, what is a Sephardic Jew, and what is a Mizrahi Jew. That was the only purpose of that. So I don't want to cover too much of this because I will get bogged down in it. But generally speaking, even though we know the Jews were in this land in the Levant going back at least as far as back as 1208 BCE. That means they existed for at least a period of time before then. We just don't know how long. We can't say that with any definitude. We can say that the Bible's actually pretty darn accurate when it comes to King David and when it comes to the kingdom of Israel, the United Kingdom of Israel it was called, because there were originally the 12 tribes of Israel. And it was first under King Saul that they came together and formed the United Kingdom of Israel of all 12 tribes. But really, the Jewish people came into their own under King David around 1000 BCE. He, other than slaying the giant Goliath, he also made Hebrew the language, the official language of the Jewish people. Aramaic was still very much being spoken a lot in the area, even though Hebrew was as well. And King David made Hebrew our language. For a while under King Saul, the capital was in Hebron, which is today in what most people call the West Bank. King David moved the capital into Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people ever since then. It was around 1000 BCE. So for the last 3023 years, that's all. A lot longer than even London has been the capital of any English country. So anyway, we know that because of pottery shards that have been recovered that are written in Hebrew from 1000 BCE. There's also what's called the Tel Dan stele. I talked about steles before. This was one found in Tel Dan, which is an area near the Galilee, just north of the West Bank in Israel. And on it, etched in the stone, it talks about the king of Israel and the house of David. And it dates to 1000 BCE. So it's really incredible that they've been able to find these things and show that there are portions, at least, of the Bible that are a history book. I'm not claiming that every word in it is accurate, and I'm not a theologian, and I'm not here for that. What I'm telling you, though, is that the Torah, what we call the Torah, what you call the Old Testament, several books of the 5 books of Moses are really read just as a history of the Jews up to a certain point, basically, the Maccabees, and a little bit after that. But anyway, so that much we know. Eventually, after King David comes King Solomon. King Solomon is the one who builds the temple on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. The temple stands for 400 years. It is the symbol and the center of Judaism. There have been some things uncovered that can prove that the temple at least stood going back as far as about, it's either 587 or 597 BCE, even though in Jewish history, we say it was a little bit earlier than that. But the problem is most of the evidence for the first and second temple will be located under the Temple Mount, which today is the most hotly divisive piece of property on the planet, because it's where the Arab Muslim conquerors who came in in the 7th century CE, about 2,000 years after the Jews first lived there, who ultimately built on top of the Temple Mount an area that included the Dome of the Rock, which included the foundation stone and the Holy of Holies for Jews. It's the center of where the Ark of the Covenant was held. And they also created Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the place, according to Islamic history, where Muhammad descended to heaven. Although, I'm not going to get too much into the Sunni Shia difference, but for what it's worth, while Jerusalem is the third most sacred city to Sunni Islam, third only to Mecca and Medina, it is not to Shia Islam. Shia Islam, would be, for example, Iran. Most, if not maybe even all today, Palestinians are going to be Sunnis. So anyway, that's just one thing, but that's an entirely other story that we could get into at some point. But the bottom line is we know that there was a temple there, and we know that after Solomon died, there was a breakup of the kingdom of Israel because there was disagreement over who was going to be the successor. So it split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. We know that then it was the Assyrians that came through. It's 733, I believe, BCE, and they conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, which included 10 of the 12 original tribes of Israel, which is where you get the phrase the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Because the Assyrians, unlike the Babylonians who exiled a percentage of the Jews all to the city of Babylon, the Assyrians scattered those 10 tribes across as wide a territory as they could. So they lost contact with one another. And while we have potentially been finding some of them, I mean, the Ethiopians, for example, although that's a different story really altogether. But there are tribes like the Igbos in Africa, even. There are some who say actually that the Pashtuns originally were B'nai Israel, were children of Israel, and became what's called Musta Arabi, which is essentially Arabized. Nobody can prove that today, but these stories exist. And if you go and you talk to them, there's actually a video that was done. There's a young guy named Rudy Rochman, who I don't know personally, but I've watched his videos. They're very interesting. He actually went somewhere that had a very large Afghan population. I don't recall where it was. And he asked, and they were all sort of coy about it at first. And then, they all pretty much admitted that they know their stories that have been passed on for generations, that they were one of the original tribes of Israel. Anyway, so northern kingdom of Israel is destroyed. Southern kingdom of Judah remains until the Babylonians come under Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure that you've heard that story. One thing may surprise you. There were about 2 million Jews living in the southern kingdom of Judah at the time, and they were not all exiled to Babylon. There was no way 600 BCE to transport 2 million people, from the Levant to Babylon. So actually, it was about 10,000 Jews that were exiled, and they took what they considered the cream of the crop. The prominent citizens and people involved in governing the area, and the professionals and things like that. And so the Jews were kind of lost there without all of their institutions, but nonetheless, they were not all exiled. That exile lasted for about 50 years because the Babylonian Empire did not last long because of the gigantic, formidable Persian Empire that then erupted, and under Cyrus the Great, who conquered vast swaths of territory all the way up to and including, the land of Israel. He had a different notion of conquering than the Assyrians and the Babylonians. While the Assyrians and the Babylonians were imperialist in certain ways and were colonizers in certain ways, the Persians were more interested in, we want to have dominion over this territory to allow the people who live there to have their own autonomy. And so Cyrus the Great and the Edict of Cyrus, which you can find a picture of it online, it's really cool looking. It's a like clay cylinder. It's essentially like the Emancipation Proclamation for the Jews. And he basically said the Jews can go back to their homeland, in the land of Israel, and they can rebuild their temple. And so that's what the Jews did. So let me jump ahead now for a little while. You've got about 200 years of peaceful living between Jews and Persians during this time. And then you have the Greek Empire, first through Alexander the Great, who basically conquers the entire known world almost. And he also doesn't care necessarily to try to change the Jews or anything like that. He's just, he just conquered the whole world in 10 years and died young. But anyway, the Greeks they believed that their culture was, superior, quite frankly. And there are a lot of great things about Greek culture. A lot of Jews actually did enjoy a lot about Greek culture. But after a certain amount of time, you get to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who basically outlaws Judaism, and who desecrates the temple, who renames the temple after Zeus, or actually it was after Jupiter, put idols in the temple. Anyway, eventually the Jews had enough, and that's where the Maccabees come in. That's the story of Hanukkah, is that somehow in a miracle, and people only talk about it as the miracle of lights, a festival of lights. No, really what it's about is somehow this group of Jews with no real fighting experience defeated the mightiest empire in the world at the time, the Greeks, and regained their sovereignty in their homeland. That became harder when the much bigger and more powerful Roman Empire came through next. And at first, they got along fairly well, but eventually it was 63 BCE that the Roman general Pompey conquers Jerusalem and eventually all of Judea. And so that Maccabean stint of sovereignty that the Jews had in the land only lasted about just shy of 100 years in Jerusalem, and about 77 years in the whole of Judea. Rome at first permitted the Jews to continue with Judea to rule autonomously with limited interference, but they heavily taxed the Jews. They needed to fund their wars. Rome was big on those. You probably know the name of Rome put itself in charge of appointing essentially the Jewish high priests and kings, and they appointed Herod in 37 BCE. And Herod was a brilliant architect, way ahead of his time, did great things with the Second Temple and with the areas around Masada and things like that. But he was also a vicious tyrant, complete madman and lunatic. And he was completely loyal to Rome. He even put the Roman eagle up on the Second Temple, and that did not go over well with the local population.
So what's going on with your neighbours at this point? Are they suffering the same fates from Alexander the Great and the Romans, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on who you're talking about and at what particular time. But I think that in terms of understanding the modern Middle East, you have to realize that while certainly there were some Arabs, people from the Arabian Peninsula who made their way out of the Arabian Peninsula in smaller numbers to certain areas, there was no mass migration of Arabs out of the Arabian Peninsula until the 7th century CE. Okay, so we are still where we're talking about more than 700 years away.
So the population spread in that particular area, is it all still really in this fertile crescent? And out in the desert, are people in much smaller numbers? Are they much more nomadic, so they can't be conquered in the same way? Is that a fair representation? So the bulk of the people are really there on the crescent where Israel is now, and that desert area is much more sparsely populated.
Yes, but don't forget the Fertile Crescent is not just modern day Israel. It includes Lebanon, it includes Syria, it includes all of northern Iraq.
Right.
So anyway, even I don't know if it. Anyway, I'll leave it at that because those are the areas.
But you've also got a big river there as well. So were people the other side of the river? Was that the Euphrates?
Well, if you're going north, yes. If you're talking about Israel, you have the Jordan River,
of course,
which is north-south, and the Jewish kingdoms and Judea and Judah and all of its different names were always on both the western and eastern bank of the Jordan River, although it did not go far into what is today the country of Jordan.
Right. Okay. So is it, in terms of river, is it a river that's easily crossable with bridges, or is it something that you need to cross by boat? Is it a raging torrent, or?
I'm sorry. Anybody who has seen the River Jordan knows why that's funny. You could just walk across it.
Okay,
it's more of a stream than anything else. But there is the Sea of Galilee that pours into the Jordan River, which is a nice large lake,
Okay.
freshwater lake. The River Jordan flows south and into the Dead Sea, the lowest area on Earth,
Right. Yeah.
most where nothing lives. And it's a fascinating place to go because you can't swim in it really. You can't stand in it. It is so salinated that you float. So it's literally like being on a raft, except you're on the water. So anyway, it's a fascinating place. But
I've seen pictures. It's fascinating. Yes.
Just to add a little bit to that map, you down at the southern end of the Fertile Crescent, you've also got Egypt that figures prominently into the blockade of the Gaza Strip.
Yes, so the most fertile area at that particular time, Egypt did not look thousands of years ago what it looks like today in terms of when you think of desert. That entire area of where we see the Suez Canal now and the Nile River Delta and all, that was the most fertile soil. That there's a reason that civilization blossomed there. Everything was green. But you have to realize that what's in between Egypt and Israel is the Sinai Peninsula, and the Sinai is desert. Okay, so when the Jews, and I don't think that there's enough archaeological evidence to prove this part of it. So I'm just telling a story here, but the story of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt into Israel, 40 years of wandering through the desert, that would be the Sinai and the Negev. Because the Sinai Peninsula is all desert and southern Israel is all desert. They're just have two different names. But so I don't know, frankly, if Egypt is considered to be a part of the Fertile Crescent. I think that it is its own thing. But I could be wrong on that. That's not.
No, I agree. It just, the land, they border each other on the map. And, of course, the Nile was very fertile and is still. There are still fertile areas there today. Some of the Nile is not swimmable, right? It's quite polluted in areas now. But it's useful to know when we're talking here, because I don't think a lot of people know the geography. Exactly where Gaza is, where Egypt is, and where Israel is. And so when we talk about the Sinai Peninsula or Gaza Strip or the blockade and how these geopolitical forces figure into each other, it's useful to just try to paint a picture of the map for the listener.
Yeah, if only there was somewhere on the internet we could go to see a map of that. So
that's exactly what I just did.
Let me try to paint a picture for you, if I can, just for the listener. As best I can, of just that little area there. Start in Egypt, okay? In Egypt, you are going to the northeasternmost portion of Africa, okay? And that's where you have Egypt. And Egypt is, it's not perfectly symmetrically shaped to call it anything. It's basically a trapezoid that then has this little arm coming out of it in its northeastern corner. And that arm is a separate peninsula called the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula borders Gaza, which is a tiny strip of land right on the Mediterranean Sea on the westernmost portion of modern day Israel in that area. And it borders the Sinai. The rest of the border of the Sinai is Israel, which goes all the way down to the Red Sea at the port city, the beautiful city of Eilat. And then you have Israel proper. You have the disputed areas in the West Bank. Everything to the east is now modern day Jordan, which literally is a country that was created out of thin air by Winston Churchill and given as a present to the Hashemite kingdom for their assistance in World War I. We can get into that. They were not even from there. They were from Saudi Arabia. So that's everybody to the east. And then if you go north and so the northern border of Israel, if you're just looking at the most northern portions and the northwestern portions, it's all bordered with Lebanon, which today really a failed state and is controlled largely by Hezbollah. which is a terrorist organization which Israel last had a war with in 2006, and which is a direct proxy of Iran. They are a Shiite militia group. They get all of their funding from and all of their orders from Iran, and they have something like 300,000 missiles currently pointed at Israel. So that is one of the concerns in this war, is that if it becomes a multi-front war, the Iron Dome is good, but 300,000 missiles, not going to do too well against those. So
talk for just a moment about the placement of Syria as well, because
exactly, that's
Syria may be. Oh, you were going to. Okay, my apologies.
Yeah, that's the only other country that borders Israel, and that would be in the northeastern corner. So Lebanon is a very thin country, like Israel is. It's even a little bit thinner. Syria goes much larger and outwards toward the northeast, and it borders Israel on the Golan Heights. We can get into that, but basically the Golan Heights is one of the most strategic places in the region, because you have the high ground, and the Syrians would sit atop there and just pick off kibbutzniks and other Israeli civilians. In the Six-Day War, Israel took the Golan Heights because basically they did not have defensible borders without it. We'll get into that a little bit more, but those are all of the countries that border Israel, because the entire west coast of Israel is just bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, so that's the best I can do to paint a picture for you without, but you can look it up as well. Now we're back in Judea, and actually we're at the time of Jesus now. In terms of Jewish tradition, Jesus is not going to be a central character, but of course he has more of an impact on society than probably any Jew in history, because he, of course, was a Jew from Judea. He was actually a rabbi. All rabbi means is teacher. He was also a carpenter, because there were no rabbis that were just rabbis in those days. They all had other jobs. And he was a kind person, whether or not you believe that he had, if he was divine. It is well known that he was a good-hearted, kind, and loving person who gained many followers, and that he was ultimately crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate around 30 CE. Actually, the very first Christians were all Judean Jews. They were all, Christianity started as a sect of Judaism that believed that Jesus was the Messiah. That's what it started as. Once Constantine was converted in what was it, 312, somewhere around there, then Christianity starts to really take off, and no longer is it a sect of Judaism. In fact, about 50 years after, 50 to 100 years after Jesus' death, you can see in some of those gospels that there was a conscious decision to make sure that Christianity was not just Judaism, but with Jesus as the Messiah, but that there were going to be differences between the religions, and a lot of them. The Sabbath was no longer on Saturday, it was on Sunday. Circumcision was no longer required, things of this nature. So it started as a sect of Judaism. It became its own religion, and instead of it being an ethno-religion, the way that it would have started and the way that Judaism started, it became just a religion that could be spread, and anybody could become a Christian just by accepting Jesus as their Lord and Savior. Then we get to the first of 3 Jewish-Roman wars that were fought. A lot of people don't realize that, and they think that it was just the one war. And then the narrative tends to be, the Romans came through, they burned down the Second Temple, and they kicked out all the Jews, and then they were gone for 2,000 years. That narrative is false. Very first war that they fought, yes, unfortunately, the Romans did in 70 CE destroy the Second Temple, and you can see depictions of their looting of the temple and celebration of destroying the temple on the Arch of Titus in Rome that still stands today. If you look up photos of it, it's actually quite fascinating to look at. You can see them carrying the menorah, for example. It's quite obvious, and that's really the only way that we know what the original menorah looked like, is from the Arch of Titus. The Jews were essentially, I'm going to tell you something here that, these follow the definitions of words, but that you're not used to hearing in this way. the indigenous Jews of Judea were colonized by the Romans. That's what happened originally. But anyway, the Jews were largely massacred in that first war. There was a second rebellion called the Quito's War, which was a very unique war that involved several different areas across the Middle East revolting against the Romans. It's not really, it's very interesting, but it's not pertinent to our discussion today. But the third revolt is, so I have to at least mention that there was a second one. The third revolt was by far the most devastating revolt to the Jewish people. It's what's known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, because Simon Bar Kokhba was the leader of this revolt. And that went on from 132 to 135 CE. And you may or may not know this, but the Jews actually managed to kick the Romans out, and they reestablished sovereignty in Judea for 3 years. They actually, it was... there are coins that are still being dug up all the time that talk for the freedom of Jerusalem, because from that exact era, because it was so celebrated, that they were going to be building the third temple. This was the return of Jewish sovereignty, but it only lasted 3 years because the Roman Empire was massive, and eventually the Emperor Hadrian brought in 12. I forget what the right word is, if it's armies or garrisons or whatever it is, basically from as far away as Britain to also areas of Egypt to areas of, Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, and portions of northern Judea, basically just completely overwhelmed the Jews. Hadrian was vindictive in this war. He was embarrassed that this little group of people when do you hear of the Romans being defeated? Romans are invincible. So he was extremely embarrassed that these pesky Jews managed to reestablish their sovereignty for 3 years. And so when he came through with his massive force in 135, he slaughtered more than 1 million Jews. He took tens of thousands of them and enslaved them and brought them back to Rome. And then he made every attempt to wipe Judaism from the earth. He outlawed any practice of Judaism, all rituals of Judaism, and it was punishable by summary execution. The one other thing that he did is very important to what's happening today. He did not want the land of Judea to be associated with the Jews. He wanted to erase the Judeans from the planet. So what was
really? Do you have
was this?
So I'm really surprised by those words. I thought I was expecting just a conquering. Was this something typical that the Romans did, or was it just this
went beyond?
This was special treatment because you had the audacity to fight back.
This was the first Holocaust of the Jews.
Right. Okay.
It was 1 million Jews massacred.
Wow, that's a big number.
Yeah. And so people talk about, 70 CE and the temple was destroyed, and then all the Jews were exiled. No, there were still millions of Jews living in Judea. They just didn't have their sovereignty there anymore. And then they regained it for 3 years, from 132 to 135. And Hadrian had been embarrassed by it, and he came through vindictively, murdered 1 million of them. And the one major thing he did is to try to erase all Jewish connection to the land. He renamed the land. He outlawed the calling of Judea any longer, and he renamed it Syria Palestina, which eventually became just shortened to Palestine.
Palestine, okay.
That is not an Arabic word. There is no P in Arab, which is why if you hear an Arabic speaker saying it, you will hear him say Palestine with a B, because there is no P. It's also why Shechem became under the Romans Neapolis. But Arabs couldn't say Neapolis, so it just became Nablus.
Right. Okay. So I'm fascinated by this because this is all new information.
That's why I went back. Yeah.
Yeah. And part of the reason why I am is we've got Hadrian's Wall here in Britain. I don't know. I'm assuming you're aware of it. Yeah, and that's the wall that Hadrian built, hence Hadrian's Wall, to separate the British from the rogue Scots up there. But
he's considered one of the great emperors.
Yeah, he couldn't beat the Scots.
He was our first Hitler.
Yeah, basically he seems to have done it differently in Britain, you see, because he couldn't beat the Scots. They were just
Right.
partly, well, they're wearing skirts for starters. Hello, Scottish people.
And they're tough SOBs.
And you can't fight a man in a skirt. Come on. Anyway, so he couldn't beat them, so he built a wall. So rather than take the same level of vicious retribution, he just built a wall and says, you stay over there. So is his failure against the Scots before or after his failure against the Jews? Is it simultaneous? I'm just wondering if he learnt from one and changed his tactics for the other.
You have just taken me into an area that is a little bit more British centric and therefore not quite in my area.
I was very much aware of that. So, I mean,
but I'm looking it up right now because I want to know.
Okay. I mean, well, it's only for my curiosity because I'm just trying to, because it
was built in 122 AD. So it actually predates what he did in Judea by 13 years.
Okay, so it's quite a period of time. So it was I tell you why I'm asking the question. I was wondering if it was a strategic change of tactic for a reason, or whether there was something specific about these people in Judea that he wanted to met some really significant retribution on them for a reason. And was it because of what they did, or was it because of who they are? And it's that differential that I'm just trying to unpick.
So I think I can answer you this way. There is no people other than the Jews that ever revolted against the Romans more than once.
Okay.
The Jews did it 3 times.
Okay.
On the 3rd time, it was 3 strikes, you're out. Adrian wasn't having. He wanted it to be, there will never be another rebellion of Jews ever again.
Okay.
Make sense?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Yes, that does. So part of it was retribution for what you've done, but you can also imagine that he now has a special hatred for the people that had the audacity to do that.
Yes. Now, while Hadrian does all of this, he doesn't manage to just actually get rid of all the Jews. He only lives another 3 years. He dies at 138, and subsequent emperors were not quite as evil to the Jews until you get to Heraclius, which I don't even know if we're going to cover, but he was the next sort of Hitler-esque type of character for the Jews.
Okay, can we just do a pause there, because I need to do a time check with Andrew. Andrew's just flagged up to me that he's running short of time, so I just want to do.
Oh goodness. If that's okay, can I give you do you have 10 minutes where I can just sort of rattle off so that the people who listen to this podcast will have more of an understanding of what they're seeing today on happening? Because I don't feel like I even got to touch it. Let me just put it this way. Bottom line is, after the Bar Kokhba Revolt ends in 135 CE, that's when the real diaspora exile begins. That does not mean that the Jews leave. There is always, and it is proven with archaeology, with writings, with everything, always a Jewish community living somewhere in the land of Israel. Mostly the Jews that survived Hadrian lived in the mountains of, the Judean mountains, in that area. But then, we have basically 1800 years in which the Jews are a scattered people. Everywhere the Jews go, they are seen as an other, because they're looked at as a separate nation living within other people's nations. That's just xenophobia. Right. You have blood libels, which I'm not going to have the time to get into now, but Jews are massacred because of those, being blamed for anytime a missing Christian child went missing or was found dead. Those ridiculous stories that the Jews had to do it to drain the blood of a Christian child every year on Passover, to use that blood in their matzah, to have their power that they got from killing Christ. And people believed this for over 1,000 years. There are still some people who believe this today. Do
we know the sources of some of this stuff? Does it come from the Romans and their?
No, it comes from Norwich, England.
Does it really? Oh, bloody
yes,
British again.
Yeah, so we'll save that for next time. I'm just gonna hit the highest points until we get to the state of Israel. Basically, bad times start with the First Crusade, 1099, because instead of traveling thousands of miles to try to take Jerusalem from the Muslim Turks, a bunch of Christian crusaders decided we've got Jews, we've got our own infidels living right in our backyard, and they slaughtered thousands of Jews living in the Rhineland, in places like Mainz and Worms, and I can't remember a couple of the other names. I'm trying to get through these quickly, but that's when things started going really bad, was 1099. Then you had the blood libels. Then you had Jews being blamed for the bubonic plague. They didn't know anything about fleas transmitting diseases, so they thought it was those pesky Jews. And Jews were burned at the stake by the hundreds and thousands, such that by the time we hit about 1400, there's only 1,000 Jews remaining in all of France and Germany combined. Most of them had moved largely into Poland, actually. Just continuing, there's the migration of Jews. 1492, you get the migration out of Spain because the Jews are expelled from there. By the way, the Jews were expelled from England in 1290 by King Edward I, also known as Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Also was not too nice to the Jews, kicked us out and stole all of our possessions, and that was to fund his disastrous Second Crusade that he lost. From there, we continue on, and basically, look, there's always the yearning in the Jewish soul that existed from the time that the temple was burned down, from the time the Jews left in 135 BC, most of them BC, I'm sorry, not BC, BCE. CE. Now I'm trying to go so fast here that I am misspeaking. So
That's
let me
right.
try that again.
Yeah, take your time.
135 CE, with Hadrian's vindictive actions against the Jews there. From then, Jews did always and have always faced Jerusalem whenever they prayed from anywhere in the world, have the psalm that they repeat constantly, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand wither." You might know the tradition that at a Jewish wedding, the groom will step on a glass and everybody says Mazel Tov. We step on a glass because it's a reminder of the destruction of the Jewish temple and how the Jewish people are now scattered all over.
That. I knew about the Mazel Tov, but I didn't know about the glass. Okay.
Right. And then every single year at a Passover Seder, the Jews conclude by saying L'Shana Behaba Be'Yerushalayim, which is next year in Jerusalem. So Zionism, the desire to regain our homeland, it was baked into the Jewish soul from the day that we officially lost our sovereignty for good in 135 CE. Jews always lived in certain numbers in the land of Israel, but you actually start seeing waves of Jews returning starting in about the 1200s. You had I think it was 400 rabbis from England and France who organized a whole bunch of people to move back there. Anyway, it's the 7th century CE that the Arab conquest occurs, and that's when the Arabs, I know that this sounds weird, but it's the truth. The Jews fit the definition of the indigenous people of the land. The Arabs were the imperialist conquerors who colonized the indigenous Jews. There were still 300 to 400,000 Jews living in Judea when Caliph Umar conquered the land between 636 and 638. Israel is the world's first modern indigenous state. Okay, what I mean by that is it is the creation and declaration of the sovereign state of Israel that was the first act of decolonization that actually resulted in the indigenous people regaining control of their ancestral homeland in history. Okay? It was the most progressive of progressive causes for the first several decades of its existence. Israel was celebrated as this incredible miracle and gave hope to indigenous peoples around the world. Why are they indigenous? Because there's an actual working definition of indigenous people, not the Wikipedia version, not the Merriam-Webster version, but it's a version. What's the guy's name? It's Jose Martinez Cobo. He was the former special rapporteur for the Subcommission of Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities for the United Nations. He defined what it means to be indigenous, and it is widely accepted. It is occupation of the ancestral homeland, or at least a part of it. Yes, Jews have always lived in that land, going all the way back, we know, to at least 1208 BCE, so at least over 3,200 years. Second is common ancestry with the original occupants of the land. We know that's true both because the traditions are the same, or there are overlapping traditions for the entire diaspora of Jews. Plus, we now know through DNA evidence that it is actually and truly the case. Culture in general, a shared culture, specific manifestations of that culture that includes religion. So we have a shared religion, the religion of Judaism, shared language that comes from that land, Hebrew, or Arabic did not come from any place called Palestine, or it came from Arabia. That's where Arabic came from. Residence in certain parts of the country or in certain parts of the world, religion, a lot of this stuff has overlap. Blood quantum, essentially the amount of blood you carry of a specific people to identify that people. There's the 7 criteria. We can go over that another time, but I want you at least to understand that there has been an active effort, which we're going to get to things that sound conspiratorial, but it actually is fact the next time we get a chance to talk. But the highest ranking defector from the Soviet Union in history, his name was Ilan Pacepa, from the Eastern Bloc of Romania, who was a lieutenant general, I believe. He has written several books, and he gave a lot of intelligence that helped the United States. And he tells how the KGB created the Palestinian cause, created the PLO, created Yasser Arafat, created Mahmoud Abbas. There was no such thing as a separate Palestinian identity until the mid-1960s. There may have been a few people that considered themselves that, but basically Palestine was a Roman name for the land that was just still used by Western cartographers when they were drawing maps, but the Jews still called it Eretz Israel, and the Arabs didn't have a specific name for it. It was just part of the caliphate. There's so much more to this that just needs to be understood. Hamas didn't even exist until 1987. If this was about trying to create 2 states, that would have happened when it was offered by the British Peel Commission in 1937. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. It would have happened when the UN tried to partition it in 1947. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. It would have happened after the 6-Day War when the Jews went to the Arabs and tried to make peace. It would have happened in 2000 at Camp David with President Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat offering 99% of what Arafat had ever asked for, and everything else was just not possible because it would destroy the state of Israel. And he said no. Same type of deal, except even better, was offered to Abbas in 2008 at Annapolis, and he also said no. This is not about, it has never been about sharing the land. It has been about what you hear them say at their rallies, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That means the replacement of Israel. It does not mean living side by side with Israel. The last thing I'm going to tell you right now, and then I will leave it, I promise, is that in the Israeli War of Independence, 1948, the quote unquote borders, what you hear about the 67 borders, are not borders. They never have been borders. They're the 1949 armistice lines. They're where the Israeli army, the Jordanian army, the Syrian army, the Lebanese army, and the Egyptian army stopped fighting. That's it. And the armistice specifically and expressly says that this cannot be ever construed as borders. And the people who insisted on that were all of the Arab countries, because they refused to recognize the existence of a state of Israel anywhere in that territory. So that's important to know. And then Jordan annexed illegally, not recognized by the international community at all, except for Pakistan and Britain, because Britain had a very interesting relationship with Jordan that we will get into the next time. But they annexed it in 1950. They had the territory for 19 years. Egypt had the Gaza Strip for 19 years. At no point during those 19 years did anybody attempt to create a Palestinian state. And when the PLO charter was first written in 1964, you can read it online. I recommend you do it. It says that they're not making any claims to the land of the West Bank, currently occupied by Jordan, or the land of the Gaza Strip, currently occupied by Egypt. What they are seeking is the liberation of Palestine, which means Israel. That's the reason that there is no peace. So we can get to it, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of questions, and I way oversimplified things because I needed I wanted to give you food for thought so that when we come back, you can hit me with as hard questions as you can possibly come up with. I have no problem with it whatsoever, but I wanted you to understand that the reason that there is no peace, if this was just about sharing the land, it could have been had 10 times already I mean, it was voted on by the Knesset and agreed after Camp David. They were going to do it. It was already agreed. And Arafat walked away from it and started the Second Intifada. And basically that blew everything up because it was such a bloody campaign of almost daily suicide bombings and Israelis being murdered like what you saw the other day, except every single day, but on a smaller scale, buses blowing up, discos being blown up, restaurants being blown up. And that's when Israel put up its security barrier or wall or whatever you want to call it. And now people call it the apartheid wall. It saved lives. It ended the Second Intifada. Okay, that's the only reason it was put up. That's the only reason it's still up. And anyway, I'm going to stop right there. I needed to get some of that out because we needed to actually talk about the conflict that you're seeing on TV. And I needed you to know some of these very basic but very important points that most people don't know. I very much look forward to. I appreciate all the time you've given me. I appreciate you giving me this time. I'm sorry that I went on the way that I did with that rant, but I felt it was necessary because I want the next time we speak also to be very productive, and I want you to have the opportunity to challenge me on any of this.
There's also a moment that we'll just have to come to at the next gathering, hopefully this coming week. Seems like there was 11 days or so back in 21 where there was a short declaration of war between Israel and Palestine, and be interesting just to hear your thoughts on it. But I will say that I appreciate the early bit of this, and I want to say to the listeners that the way Zionism, so we're going all the way back to the beginning of the podcast, the way Zionism is used in Christianity is very often not anything like what you said on this podcast. So I put my mic on mute and I went off and I did a little Googling because why not? And as it turns out, the working definition of Zionism is exactly what you said.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting, and thank you for working through that part of the podcast.
For letting me get that information out to more people, because people don't look it up, because why would they? They hear it everywhere. They assume it must be true.
Well, right. And that's just part of dominant culture very often, isn't it? Because who writes history books? The winners.
Victors. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So thank you for helping clear the air over that. I am sorry that I can't stay on. There are some interesting components they're just right around the corner, and the listeners are going, no, not right now. You can't turn it off right now, because they're thinking, well, what about the connection to religiosity with the current conflict? They're thinking, okay, but we haven't gotten to the current conflict. You can't do this to us now.
It's not about religion. I'll explain it to you the next time.
Right. Well, but a lot of the U.S.'s connection.
For evangelical Christians, it certainly is. And we very much appreciate the support of the evangelical community. It's been wonderful. In fact, they are the greatest supporters of Israel, even more so than Jews in the diaspora, quite frankly. They can be counted on more for their support than anyone in the world. And we're grateful for the support. And
then, of course, I can hear a subset of the listeners going, right, now we have two wars, because we have the Russian incursion into Ukraine, which is clearly a war, and I don't actually care what the Russians call it. Now we have this war in Israel, and Libya and Syria are making border noises, right? And so there's obviously a lot of geopolitical bits and pieces to pull apart here.
I want to make sure that this is understood by your listeners here. The only way in which the United States or the UK is going to actually get involved in such a conflict like this, as far as I can tell, and I feel pretty confident saying the only way, is if Iran becomes directly, not indirectly, because they already are indirectly involved, but if they become directly involved, because then it becomes a wider regional war. But Israel has always made it their policy that they do not want soldiers from other countries dying to save Jews. That's just the bottom line. So we want we are so grateful for American logistical support, intelligence, weaponry, anything like that. But we will never want an American to die or a Brit to die fighting for Israel. It's just, I mean, Israel was almost destroyed in 67 and 73, and we still didn't allow any other troops, not that anybody was offering back then. But I'm just saying to you right now that Israel defends itself by itself. And we did it during the 20 years that we had that there was a complete, what's the word I'm looking for? Gosh, I went through things so quickly. Basically, the U.S. did not provide Israel with any weapons during the 48 war. It is a miracle they fought against 5 regular Arab armies and won that war. And the only supplies they were really able to get were a black market Czechoslovakian, against 5 regular Arab armies. And in 1967, the only ones that were supporting us really were the French, and the French cut us off entirely. So the Jews are used to going it alone, and they've had some of their greatest victories going it alone. But it's so nice to have friends. I was so touched when I saw it. Wasn't as surprising to me that the U.S. sent a carrier to the region, but the UK just yesterday sent a carrier to the region. I choked up at that.
I didn't even realize we had, to be honest.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen the news. Okay.
There's not going to be any fighting, but it's a showing of support. And to feel that support for a people that has felt abandoned for so many centuries, it means something. And I only hope that support lasts, longer than these few days when the horrible images are on TV, and that people don't start with the moral equivalency and just trying to decide who won the war based off of body counts, because certainly the fact that there were more Germans killed in World War II than there were British and Americans doesn't mean that the Germans were the good guys and the British and the Americans were the bad guys. There's a bit more to it than that, but unfortunately that's how the media often portrays the Arab-Israeli conflict. Anyway,
I'll tell you the truth. Boy, I keep doing this to myself. This is what it means to be a podcaster, folks. You just cannot you can't put a mic down no matter how badly you're supposed to.
It was my fault. I rambled off and made statements that are provocative for some people, even though I can back every one of them up.
I think that the mobilization of assets will probably remain because geopolitical tensions are so high. And there is nobody's saying this out loud, kids, but there's a mobilization of assets because, frankly, we're trying to prevent a much larger conflict. We have 2 wars that are hot wars right now on the globe. There are 2 hot
that
wars. May
be connected more than we realize. We can talk about that next time too.
Right, we've got the Palestinian talking heads on Russian TV. Pretty.
And Putin came out in support of the Palestinians today.
Right. And so I think there's mobilization of assets just to get them close. There's a needed show of force trying to keep this from getting any bigger than it is. We'll have to see if that's possible.
I can't answer that one for you. That's really going to be up to the Ayatollahs in Iran. They're going to be the ones that decide whether or not if they activate Hezbollah and their hundreds of thousands of missiles, this will turn into a wider regional war.
Right. And we should talk about the connection to Hamas, Hezbollah, and ISIS the next time around too, because
happy to do so.
We are just at the beginning. Matthew, I am now putting my mic back on mute.
Okay.
Still unbelievable listeners. Thank you. And there will be a part 2. Eric, thank you.
Thank you. Honestly, this was wonderful. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, don't hang up yet, Eric. So yes, listeners, we haven't made it through everything. I knew this was going to go long. I just didn't realize that Andrew would unfortunately have to create a pause point. We will reconvene as soon as we possibly can. And I'll beat Andrew up until he caves and says he can do it tomorrow. But just to tidy up this section of the show, Eric, before we replan for part two, there's a couple of things in the bit that you were saying a few minutes ago. So we've established that parcel of land always had Jews on it to one extent or another, and in various forms over the time. And you mentioned about the Arabs coming in. Where did the Arabs come from?
From the Arabian Peninsula.
So that's south.
It would be okay. So I'm sorry. Sometimes I say these things, and I have the geography of the Middle East so memorized in my head that I don't think about that fact. So okay, let's start at Israel.
So we're talking Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman. So that area, or are you talking around Afghanistan?
I'm not talking about Iran, Afghanistan. I'm talking about the Arabian Peninsula, which is bordered on its west side by the Red Sea, on its right side by the Strait of Hormuz, which is across from Iran, which has little parts coming out in the Strait of Hormuz with the UAE and with Qatar, which has Oman and Yemen in its southern portions.
Persian Gulf, Red Sea. So Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, UAE. Yeah,
and that's where Mecca,
south,
Medina, and where Islam came from, where Muhammad came from, etc.
Okay, so the Arabs were down in there. Presumably, they originally, way back in history, relocated into there from Africa, but so that's the Arabs had been there for a period of time, and they basically moved north, closer to.
They moved a lot more than north, because Arabic is now spoken from the Atlantic to almost the Pacific.
So they obviously moved back into Africa as well. But I'm talking about in this context, in the context of what you talked about earlier. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So who was in that area before? Or was it literally just because I know I asked this earlier, but just to re-clarify, because that area is mostly desert. You need to go quite a lot further north and east before you get to greenery, looking at this map anyway. So just to remind ourselves, you've got that green bit of land where Israel is, and Lebanon and the other countries that you were talking about always had people on there for thousands of years. Further inland, mostly desert, sporadic peoples, not densely populated, until the Arabs moved in, and then it became more populated?
Not really. That area didn't become more populated, and it still is very sparsely populated, quite frankly, but for a very long time. It's not like the Arabs came out of Saudi Arabia and decided, let's find the worst places to live on just sand and no water. And no, they went to the Fertile Crescent as well, and they went in North Africa as well, and they went into the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they went to the places that anybody would want to go to. So basically most of the land that doesn't border the River Jordan, that is a part of the modern state of Jordan, was just desert, uninhabited land for the most part, and then continuing all the way to its eastern border with Iraq. Northern Iraq was very north, and central Iraq was very filled with people. Areas of southern Iraq until you get further south toward Kuwait, and you actually get to the areas that border water again. But that entire area in between is also largely unpopulated during this period of time.
Right. Okay. Because everybody wants to be near greenery and water, because you can't live without either.
The entire history of conflict that has existed between clans, for thousands of years, basically can be tied back to where's the water, because for thousands of years it was, I have the water, therefore if you try to take my water, I will kill you. You have water and I don't, therefore I'm going to kill you and take your water, because otherwise your family didn't live or their family didn't live. And so that that is the origination of the culture of the Middle East in the areas that weren't a part of this Fertile Crescent.
Right. So the
battles over water.
And I get that. So just to clarify then, and to lay that on as a template over the bit of history that you've been talking about, because you mentioned some of the major conflicts and the major things that happened, but presumably dotted around between all of those bullet points that you've gone through, we have got small scale regional level conflicts for this reasons going on. It's not that people weren't necessarily living in peace with each other, or there might have been an uncomfortable peace, but there was regular fights, discursions, minor brawls. I don't know what language you want to use, but I'm assuming that's probably what was going on.
What period of time are you talking about?
The period of time that you were talking about in the first half of this show. So when the Romans were involved, before the Romans got in, when Alexander was about, when you've got all this mixture of people living there, it wasn't peace when they were being occupied, presumably.
I mean, yeah, I mean, around the time of Jesus was a time of great internal strife and bordering on, or you could even call it civil war in the Jewish community. I mean, there have been, and I want to be careful how I say this, because I don't want to in any way make a Christian feel that I am in any way denigrating their religion, because I have the utmost respect for Christianity. But in history, you can see, I'm talking about historical facts, that in times of great unrest, there have been more than 1,000 different quote unquote messiahs.
Mm.
And this was a time of great unrest. And Jesus was not the only one who people claimed was the Messiah at that particular time. Now, I'm not a particular expert in that area, because again, that gets into more of Christianity. And so if somebody who has more knowledge wants to jump at me and say, no, you're wrong, I could be and I want to hedge on this, because everything that I say, I want to be able to be fact checked and to be correct.
Yeah.
And on
I'm familiar that your remit here was to talk about the state of Israel, not the religious implications. Right. So that's fine. But what I'm just trying to get is, in terms of the politics, presumably between the major uprisings against the Romans, there were smaller guerrilla style excursions against them. They didn't just submit under them and bide their time.
They pretty much did.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't necessarily horrible under the Romans or the Greeks for a time. Until then, it was. It wasn't horrible under the Greeks until Antiochus IV, the Epiphanes. It wasn't horrible under the Romans until Pompey came and conquered Jerusalem, and then Titus came and destroyed the temple. Life was okay. They didn't have their sovereignty, which Israel has now and today, and it's why Israel changed. This is one of the themes of everything that I do. Israel changed the existential condition of the Jews. Okay, for 1,800 years, we were victims on call. We were the scapegoat for every society's ills. Anytime a king needed funds, he would steal them from the Jews and kick them out of the land. Anytime there were people that were found missing or dead and they didn't know what had happened, they would blame the Jews and murder the Jews because they were just this other people. It was just xenophobia, really, mixed then with the religious forms of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism it is a mutating virus. It started because really Constantine first referred to the Jews as Christ killers. That's where it starts for religious-based reasons. Then it gets conspiratorial. It's the Jews are poisoning our wells, the Jews are killing our children, and all of a sudden anti-Semitism becomes a conspiracy theory. Then it continues on, and you get the racial aspects of it, which started somewhat during the Spanish Inquisition, because after a while it became not enough if you converted to Christianity, because they knew that there were at least some Jews out there that were still practicing Judaism in secret. And so they decided if you have Jewish blood, that's enough to kill you. And so that started there. And that's really what Nazi Germany was all about. It was eugenics. It was social Darwinism. It was the Jews are a dirty people with a dirty blood that is dirtying the Aryan German blood, and therefore they are racially inferior. They're subhuman. If you think about it, what they use, the Zyklon B gas, is what was used to kill insects, because that's what they saw the Jews as, pests that needed to be exterminated. And so again, it's just very, and now the modern form of anti-Semitism, and again, I'm going to say something now that I know will be somewhat controversial, but again, I can back up. The modern form of anti-Semitism that you see mostly is anti-Zionism. And now let me be careful, because I'm going to explain what anti-Zionism means. It does not mean criticizing the Israeli government. If that's what it meant, then everybody in Israel is an anti-Zionist because they argue about everything. They all criticize the government. Okay? Anti-Zionism means you don't believe Israel has the right to exist. It means of all the peoples in the world that have a country, a recognized UN member state, only Israel has no right to exist and should be wiped out of existence. That is anti-Semitic.
Okay, and thank you for clarifying that up. Yes, it's clear I've got some learning to do, because I don't know where I got that bit about the God-given aspect from it, which I mentioned earlier.
We can talk about that. There are some Jews that talk that way. I just wanted you to know that all of the early pioneers, the government that led Israel for its first 30 years was called Mihai at first, then it was the Labor government. They were all secular Jews. There's never been, the closest there's ever been to a religion. I mean, I guess Naftali Bennett is a modern Orthodox Jew, and he was prime minister for about a year, during that weird period in between when Netanyahu wasn't. Israel is not a theocracy. Israel is a democracy. The only role that the rabbinate has in terms of religion is over some issues of marriage and divorce. And that was a deal that there's a whole story behind that I can't get into now. But just so you know, the modern state of Israel is a democratic state that is a nation of laws that provides equal protection under the law for all of its citizens. There are Arabs on the Supreme Court. There are Arabs in the Knesset, Israeli parliament. There are actually, I think at this point, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to say, let's just put it this way. There are a lot of Arab doctors who go into a hospital. The universities are loaded with Israeli Arabs. For the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, Israeli Arabs are grateful to live in Israel, not because they have some great love for the Jews or anything, but because of the life they have. Israeli Arabs live better than any Arab anywhere else in the region, except maybe areas of the United Arab Emirates. But quite frankly, considering the universal health care that they all get, and all the other social safety nets that exist, and again, it's not apartheid. There is not one rule for Jews and one rule for Arabs. Rules apply equally. There may be forms, not maybe, there are, because it's human nature, that there are prejudices that exist, but there is equal protection under the law. And if you are prejudiced against, you can bring a case in court. It is a nation of laws, and people don't see it that way, and they don't understand it that way. And I will get into how it is actually, and has been one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in history. And the difference between misinformation, which is just the wrong information, and disinformation is that disinformation, as the Russians would call it, disinformatia, is to actually get a narrative to ultimately be published by a source that gives it credibility. So that's how they were able to spread in the United States, so that the entire Black community believed it, that AIDS was created by the U.S. government in order to kill Black people. That was Russian disinformation.
I did hear about that one, and it was extremely unuseful, wasn't it?
Being a cross-dresser, that was Russian disinformation.
I've not heard that one. I've not heard that one. That's hilarious.
People still believe it today. There is so many things that people believe, not because it's like some religious belief. It's just because it's all they've ever heard, and they had no reason to question it. that actually started as Russian disinformatia campaigns during the Cold War. And one of those is that there is a separate Palestinian people that's different from their neighbors when it didn't exist. What existed in that area, first of all, most of the Arabs who were there when the Zionists were moving in and creating a country there, they came in then, because the greatest empire in the world, the British Empire, had planted its flag there, and the Jews were bringing Western technology and money with them, and they were improving the land. So suddenly there were economic opportunities, there were job opportunities. The easiest way to see this, I can give you a list of last names, because the last, like al-Iraqi means you're from Iraq.
Yeah.
Al-Musra I can just show you the lists of the most common Palestinian last names that will show you where they're really from. Yasser Arafat was born in Cairo. He was Egyptian. I'm just saying, like, there has been, to an extent, I want to be careful with this, because the history is important, but the history is really only important to me because the Jews are being called the colonizers. The Jews are being called the oppressors. The Jews are being called, rulers of apartheid and all these different things. And so I feel that it needs to be responded to. But I freely admit, accept, and am perfectly fine with the fact that today a Palestinian people does exist. It doesn't matter that they didn't exist when Israel first came into existence. And you can see that since they didn't create a country even when Jordan occupied the West Bank for 19 years and Egypt occupied Gaza for 19 years, and nobody created a Palestinian state. They didn't want it. The first major ruler who was unfortunately empowered by the British of the Arabs living in the British Mandate of Palestine was named Hashim Amin al-Husseini, who was insulted if you called him Palestinian. He considered himself a Southern Syrian. He thought that Palestine was a name given by the Jews and the Christians to describe, quote unquote, their holy land. Al-Husseini, by the way, was the impetus for Palestinian terrorism. He started it all in 1920 with the Nebi Musa riots. I'll tell you all about it the next time. And Al-Husseini also was buddies with Hitler. He spent most of World War II in Berlin, where he was given a massive stipend and a radio station to broadcast Nazi propaganda in the Arab communities.
Wow.
I mean, there are photographs of them together. You can see Al-Husseini meeting with Himmler as well. You can see Al-Husseini being taken to concentration camps. And he was trying to talk Hitler into, when you're done with the Jews in Europe, wipe out the Jews in, southern Syria, which is what he would have called it at the time. And there was actually a group called the Einsatz Group Egypt that existed, that was a group of Bosnian Muslims that were stationed in Athens during the war, that were just waiting for Rommel to make his way to, quote unquote, Palestine. And as soon as he did, the Einsatz Group Egypt, you might know, if you know, Einsatzgruppen is the name of a mobile Nazi death squad. The way the Holocaust started was Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Nazi Germany into the Soviet Union. That is when the Einsatzgruppen, which was organized by Heydrich and Himmler, mobile death squads, they would round up the Jews. Babin Yar would be the most famous one, because they murdered something like 38,000 Jews in a single day. They rounded them all up. They made them dig giant mass graves, and they one by one shot them. Men, women, children, babies, elderly, everybody. Anyone who was a Jew, rounded up and shot. They killed about 1.5 million people this way during what's often known as the Holocaust of Bullets for roughly the first year. But unlike and I know this is going to be a shocking statement that I'm going to make here, but unlike the Hamas barbarians who were laughing as they were murdering children and beheading babies. The Einsatzgruppen, who were doing horrible things on a much wider scale, suffered severe psychological damage from it, and it caused problems such that Hitler was getting angry that enough Jews weren't being killed, and excuse my language on this, but shit rolls downhill. So it rolled from Hitler down to Himmler. He said, I need regular updates on this. Can you tell me what's going on? And Himmler asked his Einsatzgruppen SS generals what's going on. He says, they can't do it. You're asking them to, he says, we've been killing Jews every single day, men, women, children, babies, every single day for the entire summer of 1941. He says, you've already destroyed, these men will never come back from this. You've already destroyed them. And Himmler, he said, well, they're soft, it made every excuse in the book. Meanwhile, we get to about August of 1941, and Himmler actually says, you know what, I got to see this for myself. And so he goes to Minsk, and they've got 100 Jews lined up. Only they wanted to make it a little easier on Himmler, who himself had never actually seen a person be killed before. He ordered the deaths of millions, but he himself had never actually witnessed a death. He didn't fight in a war. He wasn't of that age yet for World War I. And he was a commander, Reichsführer under Hitler during World War II. So he only saw it for the first time with these subhumans that he saw as insects, known as Jews, in Minsk. That's where he went, modern day Belarus. And so they make it easier on him. They rounded up 100 Jews and made 98 of them men and 2 of them women, no children. And Himmler arrived, and he was cocky and arrogant, and he was walking around and asking personal questions of the Jews and laughing at whatever they said as they're, just shaking and they know that they're about to die. And then all of a sudden the first shot goes, and Himmler's blood all rushes out of his face. Everybody describes it that he looked like he was going to vomit. He was going to pass out. They said that he looked at the ground for the rest of the time, and it was clear that he was just trying to stay conscious. He didn't watch anything after the first one. But then when it got to the women, the Einsatzgruppen men who had to shoot them, they had shot so many women, so many children, that it had damaged them psychologically. And they were holding the weapons and shaking their hands, and they fired, and they wounded them, but didn't kill them. And Himmler, even though he was looking at the ground, he could hear this. He could hear the women screaming. And Himmler went into a fury, started screaming, "What are you doing? Kill them. Do not torture these women. Kill them now." This is a real story, documented. This is from testimony given in Nuremberg trials and also from books post-World War II. You can read all about it. But that's the reason why Himmler came back and said, okay, I see what you're talking about now. We have to find a way to kill all the Jews where it won't destroy our men. And that's when they came up with the gas chambers and the crematoria. And not only that, but they wound up taking the SS men out of it as much as possible. So they got, in every country they went to, the local well-known Jew haters who, committed pogroms against Jews for years. We can talk about those as well at some point. And they also forced Jewish prisoners, because it was either do this or I'm going to shoot you in the head right here. They're called Sonderkommandos, to actually be in charge of walking the people to their deaths, to putting them into the gas chambers, which everything was done calmly. They were playing Wagner. They had live orchestras. The Jews were just being told, this is a work camp. You're just you're being reassigned here for a while, then we're going to move you further east. And everybody was calm. And they said, okay, you guys have just been on a train loaded like cattle for however long it took, without toilets, without food, without water. For however many days it took on that train to get from wherever they were being shipped, as was being done by Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of logistics. Eichmann is the one Nazi who was tried in early 1960s in Israel. and that was a turning point for Jews that I would love to tell you about sometime. But the bottom line is they made these Jews, the ones who could play instruments, they would play instruments. They would put it over loudspeakers. They, made it all. If you're just going for a shower, they gave them a little piece of soap. They had them tie your shoes together and keep them so that you can find them afterward, because they made them all get naked completely, even though all their clothes were being sorted out and then were being handed out to the people, the Aryan people, to have all gold teeth were removed, all jewelry was removed, everything, and clothing. And you can still see, if you go to Holocaust museums or if you go to Auschwitz even today, piles of eyeglasses, that just never made their way out of there, piles of shoes that just belonged to people who just vanished because they were taken in and told, they gave them a piece of soap and told them they were going for a shower because they were disgusting. They were covered in their own feces. They had been in trains for days. So, okay, we're going for a shower. Good. I would love a shower right now. And then from the shower that you look up at, water does not come out. Instead, Zyklon B gas does. And it took something like 15 minutes. People gasping. It's completely sealed, but there was a little peephole that people were trying to smash through all the time. So you can actually see the marks if you go to Auschwitz, where people were trying to get out. Once it became quiet and they knew that it was done, they had, ventilation systems in place. They opened it up, and they didn't care anyway because it wasn't the SS men that were doing it. I mean, when you went to Auschwitz-Birkenau, you were given a death sentence. It was just either you were going directly to the gas chambers to be murdered instantly, or you were going to die a slow death by working for the Nazis while being massively underfed and massively overworked. So that's why you see the horrible pictures of those Jews who were liberated from these camps. It's because, it's a miracle that any of them survived, but a lot of them died of typhus. A lot of them died of starvation or just overwork. And the others died instantly in the gas chambers, or when it became too much because too many Jews were coming, when the war was getting toward the end in 1944, and when the freaking British and Americans were bombing the factories, the oil factories right next to Auschwitz. They could have bombed, Auschwitz. They could have bombed the crematoria. They could have bombed the gas chambers. They could have bombed just the railways on the way to Auschwitz. They did none of it. None of it. Nothing was there. There is evidence that the British knew from the very first Einsatzgruppen bullet what was happening, because they had already broken the German code and they could hear how many Jews were being murdered a day. So they knew it from the very beginning. There's so much evidence out that the Allies knew everything. And it was admitted finally in November or December of 1942. So everybody knew what was going on there, but nobody lifted a finger to save any Jews until finally January 1944, when FDR set up the War Refugee Board, and they ultimately saved 200,000 Jews total. Meanwhile, only $10 million was earmarked to that endeavor, whereas a couple years earlier, when the Nazi-occupied Greeks were facing starvation, the U.S. spent $60 million to deliver 35,000 pounds of food every month that was delivered by British ships to Greece. And so they were willing to, help the Greeks, that they were not willing to save Jews. And we can talk about a lot of it. There's a reason that Jews are so passionate about the state of Israel. It's because we were abandoned by the world. Now, Zionism existed long before Israel. Israel would have been created whether or not there was a Holocaust. There was already a de facto state there. But the British closed immigration to British Mandate Palestine with the White Paper of 1939. I hate to tell you this. The British are complicit in the Holocaust because every one of them wanted to go to Palestine. They came on boats. There was the Sturma boat, turned around by the British, wound up being torpedoed by a Russian torpedo. Over 800 people died. Jews trying to escape Nazi Germany. This happened all the time. the number of ships that went there and were turned around. Some Jews even made it to shore and were shot by the British. Some were fired upon on their ships by the British. The famous Exodus in 1947. Now we get to displaced persons, post-Holocaust. Holocaust survivors who were put in displaced persons camps that were typically just the Holocaust concentration camps that they had been tortured in, only now their guards weren't the evil Nazis, they were the Allies. But they didn't have anywhere to put them. Some Jews actually tried to return home, and they went to Kielce in Poland. The 3.3 million Polish Jews before the war, 300,000 left. 90% of the entire Jewish population of Poland, the largest Jewish population before the war, was murdered. Hitler won in Poland. He destroyed Polish Jewry. When the Jews tried to go back, the few that wanted to, Poland is the biggest Jewish graveyard on the planet. Most of the Jews killed in the Holocaust were killed in Poland in one of those concentration camps. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. Gosh, now I'm like getting lost. I got a little bit, into this, and I'm sorry about that if I'm going into it too much. But the white paper is what I was talking about, because it's so important, because you need to understand what the Jewish mindset was at the time that Israel was created in 1948. The Nazis took power in 1933. The war started in 39, ended in 45. From 33 on, the Jews were being persecuted. The Nuremberg laws, I think, came into effect in 35, and I think Kristallnacht was, 36. The Holocaust didn't get really kicked off until 41, and that's because at first what they wanted to do was expel all the Jews, but they couldn't find any countries to take them. There was the Evian conference set up by FDR in Evian, France, and I think 38 countries attended. None of them would take any Jewish immigrants. And so this was a massive propaganda victory for the Germans, who then put it out in the papers. These Westerners claim to care about the Jews, but where are they now? They won't take them. Who wants them? No one. That's what the headline said. Germany's Jews, Europe's Jews, who wants them? No one. And that was the fact. So 38, they get shut out of every single country in the world, except the British did do one good thing, and that was the Kinder transport, where they saved 10,000 Jewish children from Germany. They didn't take their parents, they only took their children, and they limited it to 10,000, but that's a hell of a lot more than anyone else did. But in 39, they closed the doors of immigration to Palestine, which was illegal. It was actually illegal against the mandate that they were given by the League of Nations. The League of Nations told them it was illegal, and they did it anyway, because the British were given the mandate to Palestine for the purposes of establishing a Jewish national home, and they were told as part of their mandate they must encourage and assist in the immigration of Jews to the land. And they cut it off entirely because of Arab pressure, most of whom had just moved in. But because that land had been Islamic once, it must be Islamic forever. We can't have Jews having a state here. That was essentially what that was all about. And it was also about Hashemite al-Husseini, the Nazi piece of garbage, who started riots against Jews beginning in 1920. But with that white paper, that meant that not only did every country shut them down, but they couldn't even go home to the one place on earth that Jews have been trying to get back to for 2,000 years. And they finally were, I can show you headlines in newspapers from 1920, the San Remo conference, where the 15 mandates were awarded. People think it's just the mandate of Palestine. No, there are 15 mandates. They split up the Ottoman Empire and Imperial Germany. There were mandates. The entire Middle East is the product of the mandate system. A lot of Africa is a product of the mandate system, as are various islands in the Pacific and Papua New Guinea, and a lot of them, because they were German colonies and they were Ottoman Empire parts of the Ottoman Empire. But only ever talks about the mandate for Palestine. But that was the one purpose. The Arabs were to get basically the entire Middle East, and the Jews were to get a sliver, and that ended up not being good enough. But regardless, in 39, when they closed the doors, Ben Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, he was the leader of what were called the Yeshuv, who are the Jews of pre-state Israel. He said, we will fight the Nazis as if there is no white paper, and we will fight the white paper as if there are no Nazis. But that was really just PR. A lot of them joined the British Army and fought with the British because obviously they're going to fight the Nazis first. But then when it became clear that the Nazis were on their last days, and the Yeshuv were so angry with the British for keeping the doors to Palestine, for getting millions of Jews killed because they weren't allowed to leave, that they started attacking British troops in British Mandate Palestine in 44 or 45, the Irgun, the Lehi, and then later Haganah. And when Churchill was voted out, because Churchill was very much was a Zionist, but when he was voted out, and who was it, Adley? The bottom line is it was a Labor government that replaced him, and they decided they decided to keep the white paper policy in place, which was outrageous because you had hundreds of thousands of Jews in displaced persons camps. I had started to tell you, some of them tried to return home. When they got, the people hated them. They said, we thought you were all gone, you Jews. They had already taken over their homes. They had no place to go to. The ones that actually did get to their homes, there were pogroms against them. The Kielce pogrom in Poland being one of the most famous. Weeks after being liberated, I don't know how many exactly it was off the top of my head, but roughly, maybe 40, 50 Jews were murdered in pogroms. It's outrageous. The Jews had nowhere else to go. And, that was the big thing that Joe Biden said during his first major comments on the Hamas massacre. He was telling the story that he's told many times before about when he was a young senator and he met Golda Meir, who was a former prime minister of Israel, first and only female prime minister of Israel back in the early 70s, and one of the founding mothers of Israel, a fascinating woman. Helen Mirren just played her in a movie called Golda, actually. And she explained the security situation they were facing to Biden, and Biden was looking very worried. And so they went outside for a photo op, and Biden loves to tell this story, and she could tell that he was uncomfortable. And she leans over and whispers into his ear and says, "Don't worry, Senator Biden. We Jews have a secret weapon. We have nowhere else to go." That's what people don't understand today. Yeah, people in Europe tell us to go back to Israel. People in Israel tell us to go back to Europe. No, Israel is our home. We are never leaving. And that is the problem, because Hamas and the Palestinian Authority see us as the next in the line of crusaders. They see us as faking a history, a connection to the land. They see us as invaders and colonizers and settlers. No, we came home, and we've always been here. And most of you just got here.
Yeah. I understand from the passion in your voice, Eric.
Sorry.
No, don't apologize. Please don't apologize, because the very clear passion with which you've just been speaking has genuinely helped me to understand why Israel is so important to you. Because unless it's one thing to know bits of the history that you've talked about for the last 20 minutes, and you can't be my age and not know bits of that history, but it's something else entirely to feel that emotion.
I kept it in check, and then as soon as we said 10 minutes to go and I started talking fast, it all went to hell. Plus, but that passion is the way that if I was not trying to just be professional, that I would speak about it with, because it is a passion that I feel. And you need to understand also that there is all the evidence in the world that the Jews, even though they had a right to all of the land legally given to them by the League of Nations through the Mandate for Palestine, They were always willing to share it with the local Arab population, and the Arabs always said no. That is the part that people don't understand. Still today, they say, end the occupation. What the heck does that mean? The Arabs, the Palestinians, if you ask any of them, there's a channel on YouTube. I don't know him, so I'm not stumping for him, but he does a fascinating work. It's called the Ask Project. And he goes to, and he asks very provocative questions of Israelis, and he goes to Palestinian areas. He even crosses over into the West Bank with an Arab interpreter. He is originally Canadian, so he doesn't tell them he's Jewish. He doesn't tell them he's Israeli. He just says Canadian. And they ask, provocative questions that are provided from his listeners to these people. And you can just see every single one of them. I don't want to say that. That's too much. The vast majority of them will tell you that the occupation began in 1948, that Tel Aviv is occupied, that Jerusalem is occupied, that Haifa is occupied, that Beersheba is occupied, that Eilat is occupied. Okay, if they wanted to have a country in the West Bank and Gaza, they had every opportunity to have it for decades. That's not what this is about. It never has been. And even when they're negotiating over it, and it seems like, oh yeah, but Abbas says that all he wants is a country on the 67 borders, which is not a real thing. It's the 49 armistice lines, but fine. 67 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Yeah, but there's one thing that he leaves out that always comes up and that always breaks any chance for peace. And that is the demand for the return of Palestinian refugees to all of Israel, which would destroy the state of Israel. Because even though in the entire history of the world, to be called a refugee, you have to have actually fled or have been forced from your home during a war or for some other, persecution or whatever it was reasons. You can't inherit refugee status unless you're a Palestinian. So those 700,000 Palestinian refugees were used as pawns, even though they went to Jordan and they went to Lebanon and they went to Syria. They were placed in refugee camps and never given a chance to live lives, even though they spoke the same language. Those borders were created by a bunch of Westerners after the First World War. They didn't exist before then. They were faked. The only thing that existed were clans. There was no Palestine. There was no, Lebanon. It was one area. It was the Ottoman Empire. And what always breaks down the peace talks is that demand for the right of return for all Palestinian refugees, which now the number has gone from 700,000 to, by the way, there's only about 15,000 of them left from 1948, and Israel would happily let 15,000 come. I mean, there's already 20% of the population is Arab. They already live there. It's okay. We don't demand an Arab free state, even though they demand a Jewish free state. But they say that it is lineal. Bella and Gigi Hadid, their billionaire father, is still listed by UNRWA as a Palestinian refugee living in America with $1 billion. He's a refugee. It's a joke. And it is the cause of there being no peace. Because at the end of the day, if they demand a right of return for these supposed millions of refugees, then what they're really saying is, sure, we'll take Gaza and the West Bank, but you're going to be flooded with 7 million Arabs who will then take over demographically, and the Jewish state is dead. The Jews will not commit suicide. They will not accept this. That is a red line. So that's why there's no peace.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's a lot. It is an awful lot. I invited you on to educate me, and I think I've got more than I bargained for. So
please come back and challenge me. It's okay. I don't.
No, you have said that, yeah. And I need to process. Sorry, let me just end this.
Sure.
Thank you, listeners. There will be a part 2. Thank you for getting this far. You know how to get me, reasonpress@gmail.com. Any question, any email, get it in there. Feedback I appreciate. This has been a risk for me to do this episode because I didn't know what I was going to learn. I am glad I have learned it. I hope you have appreciated our effort here on Still Unbelievable to do this. Eric will be back. I'll get him back as soon as possible, but he will be back with Andrew. This is not right for me to do on my own. I need Andrew there as my sidekick doing this with me. And until next time, please be reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.